a lot of the highest cultural values and aspirations of any given culture spring out of the altered states that they choose to embrace as their main means of like recreation and like to create a sense of community and to unwind at the end of the day. If it's like if a pattern interrupt and stuff. But yeah, we were just talking about this, how the a lot of that is because the quality of your thoughts are just, direct outgrowth to the quality of the state of consciousness, obviously, that you're in. Like it's due to the state. And so like, when a lot of people ask like, okay, well, isn't Kava this like alcohol alternative? A lot of people think that it's just something that's like either gives the effects of alcohol or is just something to hold instead of alcohol. Cause that's what most alcohol alternatives kind of end up being, like social tonics and stuff, like an O'Doul's or something. It's just something to hold. It's something to kind of give you that sort of mechanistic kind of thing. But it's funny because although there's a lot of direct comparisons that a lot of people end up using Kava as a direct off-ramp to alcohol, in some ways it's the complete opposite, right? It's an off-ramp from, addiction and, habituation to most like dopaminergic loops and stimulating behavior. But it also has an inherent lack of toxicity whenever you get it in its whole food form. And it also is not, like I said, it doesn't call to you the next day, after you use it in the sense of like having to have it, right? Yeah. There's not a physiologic dependency to it. But also, it doesn't have the impairment, the drunkenness, the hangover. It doesn't, because like, I always talk about this too, like the difference between the alcohol state of mind or state of consciousness versus one that's fueled by Kava. The more that you drink, especially past a certain point, 2, 3, 4 drinks, the more drunk you get, obviously the quality of your thoughts like drastically diminish. It just like freaking falls off. I mean, we all know this. This is like common knowledge. But, and so, the more that you drink, the more animalistic your behavior gets. Usually it brings out kind of the worst parts of you, the reactive parts of you, the parts that are triggered and driven by the amygdala and stuff. And so usually you just end up having like more and more, conversation tends to get a little bit more shallow and stupid and just like, all you want to do is, it's all the primary stuff. It's sex, it's food, it's dumb jokes, all that kind of stuff, which is okay. Some dumb fun, who cares? But Kava's kind of the opposite. Cause like, I was just telling you this actually too, before we started, that in Kava drinking countries like Vanuatu, which is like an 83 island chain country that's like 100 miles off the coast of Fiji. But in South Pacific island cultures where Kava comes from, and Vanuatu is kind of like the mecca of where Kava started. It's been used back there for at least 3,000 years, and it kind of shapes the entire social structure in those islands, right? Like everything is like centered around Kava, all their community events. They use it for weddings, funerals, spiritual ceremonies, social gatherings, basically any context where people are coming together and trying to relax, de-stress at the end of the day, reach an elevated or expanded state of mind or consciousness, reflect intuitively on the circumstances of their individual life, or to strategize, just about life in general, right? Who are we? Where are we going? Just having authentic, real conversation about things, right? So it's just used, and that's why it's kind of a symbol. It's a symbol of peace. It's funny because in Vanuatu, I think I've told you this before. I mean, still to this day, Vanuatu is still, pretty indigenously like driven. It's not as like Americanized or tourist driven as a country like Fiji. But you have these villages, right, where the chief still has like overwhelming say over what happens, and there's a like a central town center that's it's built with these like bamboo like looking like structures, and it's called a Nakamal, and that's where it's like the little community town center at the epicenter of the village, and that's where Kava ceremonies are done, like where the actual like ceremonies are done. And if in those countries, in Vanuatu, if there's ever like an inherent dispute amongst like two parties, a dispute over anything, the chief will force the two parties to sit down and settle it over Kava. Basically, that's like, it's kind of one of those things. And obviously there's endless, you can look at pictures online of, the royal family coming to the South Pacific, they greet them with a Kava ceremony. It's just kind of this symbol of peace, because it actually does put you in a state where you have higher access to empathy. And it puts you in a sort of more sophisticated, it gives you more access to a more sophisticated like subset of your emotional framework, all the emotions that are in there, right? So as opposed to like a highly reactive or like a beta frequency state where it's sort of more like reacting to your circumstances instead of like dictating the circumstances of your day. If you ever, I mean, people who meditate understand this. Like I always kind of describe like meditation at the beginning of my day like this. If I do a good meditation at the beginning of my day, or even throw in something like some Kava, that kind of is pro that kind of more of like an alpha state, relaxed, but yet focused, open and introspective, I feel like for the rest of the day that I'm more so like dictating my circumstances instead of chasing down everything that I'm doing.
Yeah, it's a lot less reactive. I mean, you're in an interesting state where you're hyper alert yet surrendered. Like it's very interesting.
Exactly.
I mean, for those that are experienced, I mean, your awareness just goes up, right? Like you're not in this completely altered state like you are with maybe psilocybin or something where you, but your awareness is increased. Your sense of presence is extremely heightened, because people see this with, I guess an example that people may have heard of before, like I'm not a big fan of the molecule, but like muscle ball, right? Like hyper presence, but it's a rather dirty molecule in the sense of how its receptor sites. But then you look at like Kava,
then the abotinic acid,
exactly, right? So you've got this like toxic effect, which I want to talk about the toxic Kava discussion because I think that's a very important one. But it's interesting because you even mentioned that. Strangely enough, I was in Fiji last week, which is weird that we're even like, it's just weird how things, like there's no accidents. But what I noticed was, a little bit of a rough country, right? Like we got a car and we didn't want to do the tourist thing. We wanted to like go into weird parts. And so we just take random dirt roads to see where we end up. Like, I mean, kind of like weird stuff. But country's in, interesting shape, rough shape. There's a lot of like, I know there's some friction between like the Indo-Fijians and like the traditional Fijians. But the one thing that I noticed is that the general vibe was like peace. Like people were friendly, happy. And then you come to like a place like America where the general vibe is like win, 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 anger, anger, anger. Like it's very, and so it's exactly what you're kind of saying. It's
endless layers of division and, isolation and different things too, as there's teams and tribes and which that's something that we can easily fall into just in general as humans, right? But for sure, like there's that sort of cohesive sense of uniformity or interconnectedness, or just like, just general peace and optimism.
Yeah.
There's a lot more of that.
For sure, man. As far as like, I want to get a little mechanistic, and then I do want to talk about go in a lot of different directions with this because like Kava is extremely interesting to me. Not just for potential altered state, but just for just as a GABAergic compound in general, just like helps my sleep, all these things. There's things that like personal anecdote, like works really well. But how does it work? Is it an allosteric modulator? Like what is it doing at the GABA site? Maybe talk like I'm a fifth grader here for a minute in terms of like what it's doing at the receptor site from a GABAergic perspective, neuroscience kind of thing.
So it's so interesting. So we have a decent idea, but some of the gaps haven't been fully filled in as far as like how things play out. Kind of like a lot of the finer aspects of like adaptogenic like mechanisms, like exactly what's happening that's creating this. How does it, how do polysaccharides or beta glucans like be able to attach themselves to white blood cells and basically tune up or tune down, all that kind of stuff. But what we do know, even just from an experiential standpoint, I mean, first of all, because Kava has been used for so long, there's so much good anthropological, accounts and literature. There's just a big volume of just like observational, like experiential data, right? And obviously the Indigenous Islanders can talk about it till the cows come home. There's been a lot of like great, romantic literature written around just the effects of Kava and how it shapes these cultures and all that stuff. But, whenever you compare, because obviously, like you said, I mean, Kava is primarily known mechanistically for its GABAergic effects, right? Because it's most famous for its stress relieving qualities, even though it's so much more than that. That's just like front and center in a large spectrum of like protective neuro and tissue protective like mechanisms that kind of coincide together. But right, so the easiest way to kind of describe this is all synthetic compounds that give you like an immediate quick shift in your state of mind or state of consciousness, like say taking like benzodiazepine drugs like Xanax or Klonopin or Ativan, diazepam, all those, or alcohol, work by essentially kind of like displacing chemistry. It's a sense of kind of like a borrow from tomorrow to pay for today. And we all know that, because that's how tolerance ensues and that's how withdrawal ensues, is that basically you're borrowing from tomorrow's feel-good chemistry to pay for today. There is no free lunch, with those substances, like when it comes to your brain. And so I want to feel good right now. And so I'm basically going to displace the chemistry, which is it's an oversimplification, but that's essentially what happens, because it leads to downregulation of receptor sites. It leads to ultimately a depletion. And then whenever you take the substance away, then you're left without that activity present to the degree that it was at baseline, right?
MDMA, that's a perfect example. Right?
Exactly.
Flood all your serotonin and then...
Exactly. So there's the downregulation that occurs. So what we do know is that Kava has complex chemistry. Instead of like kind of like I would call it a dumb dead molecule from a pharmaceutical, like a benzodiazepine that has one like clear mechanism as far as like attaching a benzodiazepine receptor site on the GABA receptor site, on the GABA A receptors. Kava absolutely has a modulatory effect and an upregulatory effect on that system. It's very, very clear. There's a phenomenon with Kava that's been observed forever before it was even subjected to kind of the scrutiny of the scientific lens, and it's called reverse tolerance. And it's something that's like super, super cool from like just like it comes from unique plant pharmacology. So basically, instead of, activating GABA receptors as in like a direct agonist, mechanism, and leading to immediate downregulation, depletion, etc. Tolerance, dependency, withdrawal, all that. Just the opposite occurs. You get the acute effect of the activation and sort of the natural release, but you also get this like synthesis and upregulation. And the more that you use Kava, as opposed to like alcohol or benzodiazepines or even opiates that hit different receptor sites, the least effective Kava will ever be is the first time you take it, as opposed to all these other substances because of that. So I call those biochemical credit cards in the sense where it's charging it. So I don't have currency to spend right now that I need for energy and focus and relaxation or whatever. And so I'm going to charge it, right? But eventually you have to pay that back with interest. So with Kava, what's so cool about it is that the weakest it'll ever be is the first time you take it. And if you get traditional preparations, because Kava is one of those compounds that in its natural form, well, first of all, let's just start off with what is the definition of Kava, because Kava is the water and pressure extraction, the whole food water and pressure extraction from the roots of Piper methysticum. And Piper methysticum is the Kava plant. In the words Piper methysticum literally mean intoxicating pepper, because it's in the pepper family. So that is the definition as outlined by the Vanuatu Kava Act in 2002. And what that means is that Kava is an ecosystem of pharmacology. It's a whole food substance in the same way that like coffee is really a food, right? Coffee is the water and pressure extraction of the beans of Coffea arabica. So you can't like take caffeine anhydrous powder off Amazon and call it coffee. It's just not. It's an isolate. Or you can't call it coca leaf tea. Yeah. Right. So once you start to isolate these different compounds from their entourage effect of all the other, co-constituents and nutrients in there, you end up with a substance that has a different safety profile, a different effects profile, and all of that, right? But Kava is one of those substances that deeply relies on the entourage effect.
Yeah, it's like a food matrix, but just in a plant form.
Yeah, and this is where some things can go wrong, and you can run into potential safety issues if you don't account for some of the major variables that actually make Kava a safe food. And Kava has been consumed safely for 3,000 years by 90% of the population in Vanuatu daily, literally without any really meaningful evidence of any kind of adverse or negative health consequences in the dosages that they're using it. I mean, cultures wouldn't use it for that long, obviously, if you have big blowback. But anyways, because Kava is an ecosystem, most of actually what people see on the market whenever they think that they have tried Kava or use Kava is actually not Kava by definition. It's Kava-derived products. So extracts, so anytime that you extract from the Kava plant, whether it be the roots and hopefully not the aerial parts, because you're not supposed to extract from those. But if you use ethanol or if you use CO2 even, that actually is a Kava-derived product that I wouldn't say it has overlap with it for sure. But what you end up doing is you cut down a good percentage and lose a lot of the therapeutic action. That reverse tolerance effect seems to essentially go away with extracts. You really don't get that. And you're left with a substance that's more or less kind of like chamomile tea, and sometimes a little stronger depending on the quality of, like, CO2 is going to be the best out of those. But still, Kava really relies on that food matrix. So its active constituents, kavalactones, there's 6 major ones, and then there's flavocavanes, which is another class of compounds that are chalcones. We can talk about those more. And then there's plenty of other flavonoids and enzymatic compounds and alkaloids and different things that kind of exist in that matrix. But I say all that because it really is like a symphony that, through some mechanisms that aren't totally understood as far as like how exactly it's interacting with the GABAergic system, and we know that it interacts and modulates the GABA receptors, upregulates, and seems to help to crescendo and to rebuild the parasympathetic response with long-term use. Because of that, there's that reverse tolerance component that goes on there, right? So, but it's not just acting on GABA receptors. It actually, it's funny because Kava has like one of the most like robust volumes of scientific literature, like of any, especially psychoactive plant compound that exists outside of like cannabis, ginseng, reishi mushroom, and Kava's got a lot of research on it. Even though it's virtually unknown by a large percentage of people, especially like into what is the real thing versus the not. But even Kava in general, because there's just like many things, there's a big gap between what goes on in the scientific community and the origin of where it's from, and like the general public. But anyways, it's what we found from the literature over the last 20 years or so. Is that Kava hits on almost every single like neuro and tissue protective pathway that we know of that's been looked at. I mean, it obviously has all the GABAergic effects, the modulation, the upregulation, all that stuff. And then it's a sodium and calcium channel modulator and blocker. It's a monoamine oxidase B inhibitor. So it affects the dopaminergic channels pretty powerfully and does something similar to what's happening on the GABAergic system. There seems to be an upregulation, and Kava is basically, it's never been observed in any context to be addictive at all. Physiologically addictive, even though it has a prominent dopaminergic effect. That's why it's really amazing kind of how it works, because it helps to supplement dopaminergic activity without feeding into that negative feedback loop, So like we've actually used clinically for years for people that just have addictive patterns that are stealing and robbing their attention and their energy, because anything that's robbing your attention is robbing your energy, right? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the name of the game today. It's like signal versus noise. It's like actually trying to have autonomy over one's mind and over one's mental faculties and your trajectory in life. And there's so many aspects of industry that are basically mining us for our energy, whether it be, commandeering our dopamine receptors or, pleasure centers via food to keep us coming back on that loop, whether it be in the social media companies doing it, obviously, the dopaminergic factor there. It's one thing about Kava that I think is which is a, kind of a separate conversation, but that's so profound as far as interrupting that pattern. And the indigenous people too, in Vanuatu and Fiji, have always seen it as a kind of restorative compound for self-autonomy, and that helps to it helps to feed and to build mental and emotional health over time, because of how it integrates the different parts of the mind and creates this sort of big picture perspective similar to some classic psychedelic compounds, but without the bungee jump, like super visual element. It sort of runs in the background. Yeah. We always say, like, if a compound like psilocybin or ayahuasca, LSD, or any of those, or DMT shout a message at you, Kava kind of whispers it. But that's another thing about Kava as a whole food, is that in its whole food matrix, it has that entheogenic effect. Yeah,
it's integrative. Like it's integrative. Sure. Like you look at any like classical psychedelic compound, and it's anyone that's have any experience with psychedelics knows that the work is done on the back end and the integration, right? Like you can get the message shouted at you, and if you're not, the thing that I've noticed about Kava is that it is constantly integrative. Like you are left with this malleable sort of thing that you can work with.
Yes.
And the reverse tolerance that you mentioned also seems to play into like that awareness as well. Like the more you use it, the more that you become aware of that integrative aspect of it, and you get more out of it and more out of it and more out of it. Yeah, man, you guys, I mean, true Kava, like I've been using this stuff for a long time. This stuff's like, for me, like for sleep, it's been huge. But I think the biggest thing is just like we're talking about. It's like I'm able to get that altered state of consciousness, but it's not. I think altered state of consciousness has this weird rap where people automatically think it's like drugs.
Yeah.
Right? It's like we alter our state of consciousness during exercise, during like sex, anything like it's that's an.
I actually compare it a lot to like a runner's high in a sense.
Totally,
I kind of call it hyper sobriety, right? It's like the
That's a good
upper
point.
end of the spectrum of like you, whenever you're kind of at that sort of peak state of mind, like you just come back from a concert or like you're deeply connected with someone or some sort of inspirational something where it feels like your body has mobilized it naturally. It doesn't feel like you took something. It just feels like it's taken you. It's a shortcut, a technology to kind of shortcut you to you're at your peak optimal natural hyper sobriety.
Agreed, man. Yeah, and it's perspective shift, right? I think that's like when you look at like, oh, this is this stuff's mind altering. Like I mean, no, like I mean, I can drink it like pre-workout. I can drink it now. It's not. It's perspective shifting in some ways because like how am I looking at the world? Like am I looking at it through this lens of I'm hyper reactive, I'm nervous, I'm scared. Mm-hmm. Or am I looking at it from a place of abundance, right? Like how I always say this, like how I love my family, how I love my children. I am a better father when I'm loving my children from like a place of abundance rather than a place of scarcity. Oh, I'm worried about you.
Yeah.
Don't do this. But when I'm like, you know what? Like, let me show you by modeling, by example, how you can survive and do well in this world. And it's like, that's a mind altering situation where how are you looking at it different? So
it's kind of like optimism goggles,
Yeah.
in a sense, right? And it just, the perspective, like how you relate to any given situation. We talked about this, a little bit ago. It's like you can't change the past, but you can change how you relate to the past. A lot of it is your association. Everything comes down to perspective, right? You ever have something like a life transformative event? You almost die from something, a close call, you get fired from a job, get a new one. Family member almost dies and you get a perspective shift and all of a sudden like your relationships or how you relate to everything is different and you walk around happier and your neurochemistry changes. But like this is sort of like it's a substance that helps to kind of transfer and like you deliver the capability for that effect.
No,
it does. It just there's a feeling of that's why we put like 3 verbs on there or 3. We always put relaxed, focused, inspired, or relaxed. Yeah. And like the inspired part is one of those things that people are sort of like, what does that mean? But it's kind of like if you take Kava, you know what that means. You're just like. Sure. I feel creative. I just feel like it's almost like a stress shield. Things don't affect me as much, and I generally just relate to my circumstances around me and my environment with a place of adaptation, increased adaptation, and just optimism. Like I can handle this. Like I get it. Like I got it.
It's been 1 minute since I took my first sip, and I literally already feel it. Right? It's like I mean, granted, I'm like fasted right now, and like it's sensitive, and I feel it. But I mean, yeah, I'll link out to it down below. So I put a code down below for TDL10. So it's truekava.com/Thomas. So you can check those guys out. I've never done and this is, maybe it's not safe to talk about online. I don't know, but like, is it ever used in ceremony at like really high doses for massive altered states, or does it not really get you there? Or does it just, at that point, like if you go a really high dose, does it just kind of impair you?
I love that. I love that you're going there with it. And first of all, you were spot on too with the integration piece, because that was like, there's several, keywords that I would use to describe the Kava experience. Actually, the 4 major verbs that I use whenever trying to describe like the immediacy of what you actually feel from Kava and what it helps to translate to in a person's life. It's relax, expand, connect, create, right? Because Kava ultimately is been seen and characterized as a creative substance that helps to build and expand a person's creative capacity. And the reason is because, its immediate effect whenever you first take it is that sort of grounding, relaxing effect that you get that most people feel from it. And what, the cumulative effects that's having on the GABAergic system, the beta adrenaline system and the glutamate system and all those different things that's sort of down-regulating sympathetic dominance and building the parasympathetic nervous system. It seems to be a reset for that. And so it puts you back into that centered place where all that energy is going towards just fight or flight, and it's going towards your higher faculties, which is what allows you to, your higher emotional, faculties, which is what leads to the expansion of awareness, right? You just feel like filled up, like you're more of yourself. You can access, like you have autonomy where I can access the different parts of my mind, is where if I'm in a reactive state, if someone comes in the room and slaps you in the face, you're not going to be your highest self at all. You're going to be pissed, right? All of that blood's going to go to a certain part of the brain. It's going to be fight or flight. It's going to be fight that person or get out of there. You know what I mean? And so you're not at your best when you're in a reactive stress-induced state. So that relaxing of the parasympathetic nervous system creates a space of safety that allows you to move into those those higher aspirational and reflective, especially reflection. Reflection is a big component of Kava. So that's the expansion state. So it's like, it relaxes and down-regulates, trauma and stress, long-term trauma, immediately, like acute stress. And then it goes into like the expansion. So you just feel expanded, which allows you to connect to your existential core, what most people would see the more authentic version of themselves, which is more just like an integration of all the parts of you, right? That you just feel like this is more me, right? The state that I'm in more represents me. I have autonomy. I have control over my own psyche. I can go to different places. I can access information better. I can emotionally react in the way that I choose instead of like, my lower animalistic biology kind of taking over and all that. And so you can connect with yourself, you can connect with the world around you, you can more easily connect with other people, that expanded state of awareness, and also some minor action on the serotonergic system as well too, probably, contributes to this. But Kava is also known as an empathogen, right? Like whenever you're talking with someone, the state that you're in is because of what we just, discussed, it creates the opportunity that you can access your empathy easier, but it also just tends to kind of induce a state of empathy to where I can understand your perspective a little bit better. Kind of similar to what you see with MDMA, but just on not a less bungee jump like we were talking about. It's like, but what's good about that is, what's good about that is, like we talked about before, comparing it to other psychedelics. And, the indigenous people in Vanuatu and in Fiji and the South Pacific would talk about this too, because they have access to psilocybin mushrooms and different things. And Kava is their most sacred medicine, because sometimes the most powerful and useful medicine is not the one that whacks you over the head, but it's the one that can be taken regularly and integrated into a person's life because you're living on the day to day. It's sort of like, when you're a kid, you ever go to like a church retreat or something where you got all high on, you come back and you're like, and then, or like, the honeymoon phase in a relationship, right? And then eventually you have to confront everyday life and the everyday circumstances of life. And that's why integration is so important with heavy hitting psychedelics. And that's tough because you do a bungee jump to this amazing place that gives you access.
Peak experience.
Yeah, exactly. And then spending time integrating that. And what's interesting is that Kava has actually been used as a back-end integrator for heavy ceremony with psychedelics like ayahuasca, for example, or even ibogaine, that it helps during the integration phase because it helps to ground you, to keep you grounded, but also keep in that expanded state of awareness where you get that multi-channel and you get that left-right brain hemisphere interaction to where you can see the big picture still, but it helps to ground you. And that's what a lot of people need after heavy tryptamine-induced experiences. Yes, yeah. That's the big danger, is just getting up here and saying a lot of really cool stuff, and then not being able to follow through on any of it. And then it's just, that's a caricature you could make.
Well, then it's frustrating because then you're living in this world of contrast where you're like, well, I want that again. Right. How do I get that again? And that in and of itself builds, because by all means, like psychedelics absolutely can be addictive in that sense because you're chasing peak experience, right? And that all comes with inadequate integration because you're not going to feel like that every single day. But the goal is to extract what you need out of that to, live with loving awareness and being able to, continue on in your life with the attributes of that have unfolded, integrated.
Well, and that's one of the most important points too about psychedelic use and psychedelic integration, right? And what a lot of people, apart, because we live in an age where we're in the middle of like a plant renaissance, right? Or a plant compound renaissance, a renaissance of health, all these different things. And so we're getting this sort of rediscovery of a lot of these ancient practices and rituals. Obviously, cannabis had its comeback, and obviously from a regulatory standpoint, that's still a nightmare state to state in a lot of ways. But it's not so like unfairly maligned across the board as just like this thing that's reefer madness, horrible, terrible, toxic, bad, you're going to jump out a window type of a thing. And the same thing has happened slowly with a lot of the psychedelics. Of course, MDMA, psilocybin now, medical use, all that kind of stuff. And then ayahuasca tourism and everything. And so now we're kind of in this state where it's kind of, the pendulum is kind of swinging to where like tons of people just jump blindly into these experiences and just sort of, I'm just going to do this because it's like, it's fun and it's interesting. And then I can tell everybody that I'm a good person after coming back,
So true.
Yeah.
So
and
true.
you just like, and it's a lot of it is, virtue signaling and stuff like that. That's just something that can fall into it. But what's, all these things, especially, psychedelics are some of the most powerful tools on the planet, right? For shifting a person potentially on a dime in one direction or another. But they're powerful tools. And a tool, you probably heard this analogy a million times, is like a hammer. You can build a house with it or you can whack yourself in the head with it. And, the moral dimension really comes in with the the context behind why you're using it, obviously,
intent.
and your mindset and your yes, exactly. But what a lot of people don't realize about psychedelics, especially people using psychedelics like ibogaine or ayahuasca or even psilocybin LSD for addiction, is that if a person is not quote unquote ready, and obviously there's really no objective way of measuring that before it's such a complex state of mind. But if they're not necessarily someone who's actually willing to go in and like just basically deal with whatever is thrown at them, whatever they see, if there's someone that is still more in sort of like victimhood, not responsibility kind of driven type of thing, then it can actually drive people further into addiction afterwards, because if they're not willing to integrate it tends to, if they're shown the pathological component of their ways, right, very visually, and then they're not ready to integrate that, then it actually tends to like torture a person afterwards, just kind of like you said, right? And so a lot of people will ricochet back and sort of double down into their escapism, whatever that escapism is. I've seen it happen many, many times. So you can't blame that on the compound. That's not the compound's fault. But what that is just like how much intention is necessary going into some of these things.
Or coming out of it.
Yes, exactly. Well, and why that's important, and what excites me so much about utilizing a compound like Kava is because we've seen Kava be extremely beneficial when people layer it in like during ceremony, with other tryptamine-based psychedelics, or on the front end or the back end. And the reason is because it's an expander and a grounder at the same time, like we talked about. And what a lot of people need is like that sensibility, that level-headedness, that groundedness, and they need that amygdala not numbed. Like if you take a benzodiazepine, right? Like I don't know if anyone's old recreational psychedelic users out there, but it's an old trick that if you're at a music festival and you take a bunch of whatever LSD or something and you end up in a bad trip or something, you could take a benzo and most likely it'll actually get you out of the bad trip, like within 30 minutes to an hour, because it's just. But the problem is that it'll numb the rest of the experience and your ability to reflect on the circumstances in there. And so but you are. It's like kind of like you could jump that. Not that I'm recommending that at all, but I'm just saying people do that. But Kava, its ability to, activate the GABA receptors, sites and everything, and reduce amygdala activity while integrating the mind and opening it for greater clarity at the same time. It's introspective, reflective at the same time as grounding you and getting you access to that more sort of, practical framework. But by doing that too, and this is something that what I'm really, really excited about is, research in the future that we're going to be pursuing on things like PTSD, because we've just seen it from an observational standpoint and what it does for people with long-term trauma, because you can use it so regularly, is spending time and logging in lots of time. This kind of goes back to, what you're talking about as far as like, the difference between the two, and, being able to take these heavy psychedelics acutely versus take, like a medicine that you can use regularly over a period of time. But logging a lot of time over a number of months or years in a state that is cumulatively more modulated from a limbic standpoint, right? So, lowering the limbic system sensitivity through all these mechanisms that we've discussed, while, kind of integrating the mind at the same time and bringing that sort of like reflective. It's like, we have this saying that's like, you can't change the past, but you can change how you relate to the past, right? And so spending lots of time in that, you can start to reflect on your past and current circumstances from a place of limbic safety, which creates over time new neurological structures in your brain. Obviously, it's an experience, and you start to create new associations. We just see this, right? We don't have like the heavy literature on it, but we always observe this about Kava, that this phenomenon is happening, that it just tends to be this amazing substance that people are drawn to for trauma, especially people that can't tolerate the heavier hitting psychedelics, or have used those but are looking for something to help on the physiologic rehabilitation of the limbic system and to stay in that reflective state, but also ground them. It kind of like, it integrates the best of all these things, but it also is, because you can use it every single day. I always recommend cycling things still, but it is something that is just widely, tolerable amongst like most age categories, that you can just consistently take. But to your point before, you were asking also, can you get to the really high levels with Kava by itself, or obviously, like I was just saying, you can definitely, I mean, people have and do layer it on with other ceremony because it tends to, like I said, smooth out the experience to where you can kind of not be so reactive, but not be numbed at the same time. And so just to get a better integration, but also using Kava ceremonially in very high dosages absolutely can be very intense. And this is something that a lot of people don't realize, even if they get good like traditional Kava in the United States. Like what we're trying to do, like on the True Kava front and even with the Kava Coalition, is to try to integrate Kava into modern culture as it exists in Polynesian culture to have the large net cultural impact on the collective consciousness of the we believe that it'll make a massive cultural impact. It has the potential to, because it can be as ubiquitous as coffee as a compound, and make a contribution to the collective mentality around recreational environments, redefining recreational environments. But because that's our goal, a lot of even the preparations that we use, the base dosages are sort of very mild, run in the background. You can use it as a functional beverage any time of day kind of thing. And that's how Kava starts. But the experience as you go up the gradient of like higher dosages, now assuming that you're dealing with traditional Kava, we can talk about extracts separately, but extracts, because they lack that entourage component, one thing that's clearly understood about extracts is that even the strongest extract, you can get a really potent CO2 extract that's super high quality and get a little bit of that euphoric component out of the front end. And usually after using it 2 or 3 times, you develop tolerance to it, which is kind of the opposite of what you get off of a traditional prep. But the effects, you can't just keep dosing up and it continues to intensify past probably, 3,000 milligrams or something like that. It'll level off, basically. But whenever you're dealing with traditional preparations, it'll keep, if you're drinking actual Kava that's prepared traditionally, especially high quality strains that have been properly aged, right parts of the plant, if the right strains and all that kind of stuff, it'll keep intensifying to a point where Kava can be very intense, like full body. Like I've had experiences where I'm like, holy, like this stuff is like, you feel like you're floating above your body, and it's this extremely comfortable experience. But I see it as an extreme positive though, because what's so unique about that is that you feel extremely euphoric if you were to push those dosages to have like, 15 to 20 dosages of Kava to kind of get there. What we call shells, shell, like a coconut shell if you're drinking traditional. But the interesting thing is that for the level of body relaxation and euphoria and almost like you've had some mushrooms or something, you're not impaired at all at the same time. Like you could drive easily, like there's no impairment. So like it's really unique in the fact that it's able to give you that kind of a psychoactive effect even at that dosage and without impairing your faculties at all. And then you wake up the next day and we call it an afterglow with Kava. So if you get really Kava crunk, as you call it, even though that's not a great term for it, but people call that Kava bars just to laugh and joke around. People talk about the afterglow. It's like the opposite of a hangover because the effects will kind of transfer into the next day. You wake up, and what we've always noticed is that, and we know this from the studies too, is that sleep quality is pretty drastically improved, especially in those really high dosages. And you can get by and wake up refreshed and super functional on far less sleep, right? Far less sleep for sure. And you kind of have that optimism the next day, and you're like in certain strains that have more of the double bonded kava lactones, because there's 6 major kava lactones and 2 of them, dihydrokavine and dihydromethysticin. There are certain strains that are closer to wild kavas that have those. And those have an even longer half-life that can last up to 2 days. So you get like a 2-day afterglow, especially large amounts of them. I noticed this because I used Kava therapeutically whenever I was getting well, because I was severely sick and was having like 10 seizures a day at one point. And that's how I got into this, which is a whole story of itself. But I was able to, I was able to basically have 48 hours of freedom from my convulsions whenever I was taking these specific like highly medicinal strains at the right dosages. So there's a lot of context here of there's over 200 different actively used strains of Kava in the South Pacific. Oh. So a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people think, well, Kava's Kava, and they just think that this little capsule that I get at Whole Foods or whatever is Kava, and that's a Kava extract. I'm not like maligning it or anything like that. There's usage for it, but it's a regular functional substance. Kava there's way more to Kava. It's like, that's why whenever someone says, well, is Kava this, is Kava that, is it Kava safe? It's like, well, what are we talking about? What strains? How is it prepared? how is it utilized, what dosages, all that kind of stuff, because it can change pretty drastically. But yeah, 200 different strains, kind of like cannabis. It's like the world of cannabis. There are some strains that have like higher amounts of certain lactones like yangonin and kavain that are more dopaminergic, that if you take those, they're going to be very like activating, but not like anxiety inducing, still anxiety relieving, but like very nootropic, very, very social lubricating, euphoric. And then there are strains that are very heavy, that are more on the GABAergic, GABA receptor binding, all that stuff that you can take right before sleep and they'll essentially kind of knock you out. It's like, heady and heavy and then everything in between.
Yeah.
Right?
What I've noticed with true Kava specifically is laughing. Like more like, like I think I get, I mean, I guess the way that I can put it is like a little bit more my true nature, like a little bit more like I feel the freedom to just like express myself with humor that I might like otherwise like kind of stifle because I'm like, oh, what are people going to think? So it's like a little bit more of a social lubricant is a way to put it, but for me, it truly comes out more with the humor and stuff. Like I just feel like I'm probably a more pleasant person to be around. Yeah. Because I'm pretty like, things, like things the way they are. And, and it's like,
well, humor is one of the most positive aspects of our emotional framework, right?
For sure.
I mean, it's just the ability to, even back in the day, whenever I was chronically ill, like severely, I was, suffering every single minute. But if I could find a moment to laugh or to find the humor in something, I feel like I won, you know?
Or even laugh at myself. Like, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's I've talked about this before, but like this, I don't know if you know the Adi Ashanti. He's a spiritual teacher, very interesting guy. But he talks about, he's like cool because he's like no social media. I mean, he's the real deal, but talks about how like comedians are like modern day, like they're like shamans in a way. Like they have the ability unknowingly to get you to laugh at yourself. Right. And that in and of itself is very neuroplastic. Like getting to be able to like expand and relax enough to look at yourself, even laugh at yourself, because a lot of what comedians are doing are essentially making fun of our behaviors, right? And so you're like able to step back and be like, that's not so serious. Like it's actually kind of funny that I do that. And that in a way, it disarms the ego. It breaks down the ego. And you get this ego dissolution that happens with comedians, with comedy, and they bring people together in a social setting to do that. And you actually have this collective change, this collective intent changes, the collective ego drops. And what that does probably to the energy field in that whole area is, so it's interesting that like a lot of, and it's probably also why so many comedians end up struggling, because I don't want to go on a tangent, but they struggle, right? Like you've got, like a lot of abuse and stuff in that, because like, I think they energetically take a lot on, right? They think they do because they're in a way.
And they're searching.
Right? And they have this, it's bizarre, but my point in that was that like, Kava kind of gets you there. It is very ego dissolving, but you still maintain your faculties, where you still have your identity. Like you haven't psilocybin, like, I mean, your identity's gone, right? Like you're just like, I am energy, But in this case, you're like, I'm still Thomas, but I'm aware of these things.
And like there's use for that bungee jump, but as far as like something that you're using regularly on the day to day, it's great. It's these are different tools. It's like one is not better than the other, but it's like what's so amazing about something like Kava is that, well, first of all, we kind of call it, I've used the term sober psychedelic in a sense, just because like you still have all of your natural faculties, but it kind of gives you that state, almost kind of like microdosing, like what people try to get from microdosing. Microdosing, sometimes you can get the tolerance really quickly because it's kind of what happens with tryptophan.
The difference I would say with Kava and microdosing though, I feel like microdosing, I mean, okay, it all depends, and I open myself up for scrutiny here for sure, and people are going to think what they're going to want to think, but like if you start going down like, quantum rabbit holes or just even Eastern philosophy and some of these things like psilocybin, they open you, and I feel like you open yourself up to negative attachments, you open yourself up to these things. So like, microdosing like has its place, but I feel like you need to keep a serious wolf at the door for when you do it. Like you can't just do that every day. And the moment that it starts becoming like, I'm going to microdose because I like the way it makes me think, or for a nootropic, you're missing the point. Like it's like you have to keep a wolf at the door. The thing that I've noticed about Kava is it's actually, for lack of a better term, it's shielding, it's grounding. I'm grounded. Like I'm actually okay. I'm able to feel like, no, I'm not just going to let that in. Like I am still enough of myself to actually be more aware of when maybe that person, maybe there's a little bit of an agenda there, or maybe, you're not like forming these weird attachments. You're grounded and you're yourself, yet you're seriously empathetic. So it's a cool combination.
Perfect way to describe it. That was brilliant. Yeah, because that's exactly a little bit what I was getting to there. Is that there's overlap between it and microdosing in the sense of what people think they're trying to get out of microdosing, a more integrated thinking, access to creativity, to zoom out, to see the big picture, which is a lot of times why people use psychedelics, is because they allow different parts of the brain to talk to each other. And so the experience plays out as the ability to kind of see your life circumstances from a bird's eye view and to look at all of the aspects of your emotional faculties, your past experience, like they're like a schematic in front of you, where, whenever you're in reactive, stress-induced, like daily consciousness, especially if it's stress-fueled, it goes myopic and tunnel to where it's hard to get access to the peripheral of what's all the sequence and timeline of circumstances that have led up to what has brought you here and who you are, and to have appreciation for that and be humbled by that. Just all the different aspects of, like, it's so easy to just react in the moment. Like, you did this to me, I'm going to do this to you back. Or, you know what I mean? And instead of just being like, getting clarity on it, be like, it's not worth it. Like, I'm better than that. And so, like, that's exactly right, is that, obviously you're sensitive enough to it to where you're in tune with that. And that's how the indigenous people would kind of describe it in different language too, is that it's such, if there was also like one overarching identity, one of its main characteristics as an organism, and this is one thing that's really important too to talk about in the difference between plant pharmacology, like these living, breathing, medicines, as opposed to isolated synthetic molecules, is right. These are organisms, right? They're not dead isolated molecules, and that's the reason why there's more of a biological compatibility to them. True. Because it's an ecosystem, and that ecosystem is an extension of the same collective intelligence that our bodies are. It's all an extension of that ecosystem, that collective intelligence. Call it whatever you want to, God, universe, source. It doesn't matter. Like whatever whatever label I guess you want to put on it or whatever. But it's there. We all know that it's there. If you cut your arm, it heals by itself. There's an intelligence that's orchestrating that. Obviously, your heart beats by itself. All of that. And so there's a type of cross compatibility. It doesn't mean that every organism in nature is biologically compatible, because some organisms co-evolve to be able to have a fruitful symbiotic relationship, right? And so, but Kava is one of those organisms that has adapted over many, 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 many generations, years, to be very biologically compatible and to form a relationship with the human. And I kind of think of a plant medicine is different because it's not a dead molecule. And whenever you're taking a medicine into your life, it's like forming a relationship with another substance, not someone who can talk and communicate in the same way that we're communicating right now. But to use like Dennis McKenna language, the psychedelics under this theory, can communicate to us through chemistry. There's a type of intelligence that comes out, whether or not you believe it's embedded in the plant or whatnot, if it opens up something in you. But yeah, because of that, I see it as forming a relationship with another organism, and it was alive. And the more recently that organism, like Kava, was alive, that's why fresh Kava is the most potent, the most entheogenic, the most all those things, because it has that life still in it, the enzymatic activity, all the representations of that biologically. But yeah, so it's a living organism that is biologically compatible with the human like that. But it has a lot of characteristics that are transferred to the person who's using it. Just like, there's a lot of adaptogens that have to live under very stressful conditions. So they develop the chemistry to adapt to, stressful circumstances that are compatible across biology. So then whenever you take those in, it transfers that adaptability to you. Cordyceps, for example, has to like adapt to very low oxygen, conditions, or rhodiola rosea, or any of those. And then obviously those things increase oxygenation in your blood whenever you take them in, right? There's that kind of a thing. Kava is really unique in the way that it's kind of evolved in the ecology. But one thing that it has is it's protective. And it seems to be protective like across the board, from a psychological, emotional standpoint, from a physiologic standpoint, because it's all one continuum. And that's why it just hits on all these neuro and tissue protective. It's a protective substance that transfers that to you. So that's why it's kind of seen by the indigenous people. It has this kind of maternal component to it too, this like warm blanket that wraps around you. But it also like empowers you to be able to protect yourself, right? And so, through all the mechanisms that we're talking about, it definitely gives that experience of like, I feel like that I have more control over myself. I feel like that I'm more reflective. And it's not just something that's given me sort of this like rocket bungee jump that's like blowing open, the top center of my psyche, called your crown chakra, like in Eastern language or whatnot, like a classic psychedelic, where there's opportunity, but there's also a lot of danger. Yeah. Kava protects you at the same time. And so, to me, again, it's not the most powerful bungee jump of an immediate experience, but sometimes the more valuable experience is the one that's been adapted to meet more of the spectrum of needs, the immediate needs there. And one of those needs is protection from that vulnerability that you're talking about.
Dude, I mean, you know what? No, I mean, at the risk of getting, flamed on this, I fully believe that when you open yourself up, just like you said, we all know there's information out there, and there's good information, there's bad information, there's malware, there's, you know what I mean? Like those things, it's just like, the simplest way you could explain it is even just emotionally, psychologically. And I think everyone would agree with this. Like, okay, let's just go right out there. Let's say you drink a bunch of alcohol, you're impaired, someone seems like a good person, they look like a good person, the energy feels right, you have sex with that person, and then the next day you're like, oh my God, that was like the worst thing I could have done. I just formed a chord with that person.
Yeah.
And now, like, even psychologically, take all the energetic stuff, now you have a tie with this person where there's an emotional connection that maybe isn't, you know what I mean? So it's like, and now you just have something that you now have to deal with, right? That's like the way that I sort of portray like a negative attachment or something that could happen like in a more like superficial way, right? That is a very real thing that can happen. And the point is like when you are opened up to the information sphere, whatever you want to call it out there, you absolutely positively open yourself up, in my opinion, to good and bad things, right? Absolutely go either way.
Yeah.
And that's where I think it's so important the more experienced that someone gets. Because I think the more experience that someone gets, sometimes they become even more loosey-goosey with it, right?
Yeah.
It's like, I think anyone that's done a psychedelic experience before, whether they've like gone to Peru and it's like the first time, depending on the person, I say like a lot of times the first time people take it really serious because they're like, this is, if it's the right person, I'm sure there's people, they take it very serious, they take the integration serious, and then they get used to it more, and it starts becoming a tool. It starts becoming a tool that they are chasing peak experience with, and they drop their guard with a lot of those things. They drop their guard with the integration because they're like, well, I've done it 2 or 3 times before, no problem. Yeah, because you were really putting focus there. Like that was really focused. Like you were intent was like aligned, and now here you are, 10 journeys later, you're an expert. And you're fine. You're actually opened up more to that stuff, and you need to take it even more serious. And sometimes like molecular help or, whole food help to ground you and bring you there, like to keep you safe, I think is super important. And it's a bummer that it ends up getting like sort of called woo, because I think it's something that no matter which way you frame it, like energetically, Eastern philosophy, or purely psychologically, like it's important to pay attention to.
Well, it's a continuum, right? And so, biochemistry, creates and shifts your energy, right? I mean, everything, quantum physics, everything is energy, right? But there is a layer, obviously, where things, have manifest in the physical experience, right, of the biology, right? It's like, physics and biology or whatever, people would say, who is it? Like, Rupert Sheldrake would say that the biologists have physics envy in the sense, right? And so we know that fundamentally that is true, that everything actually comes from energy and is energetic. And the problem is that you get a lot of people who make, take liberties and start to use all this language and just, strap the word quantum on everything, but we know that there is a reality to that. Whether everybody accurately represents it in a credible way is one thing. And that's where the sort of woo kind of, characterization comes from. But whenever you can shift your chemistry, that is shifting your energy, right? And vice versa, right? I mean, it's all one continuum. It all exists. You can't they're not mutually exclusive.
That's
in this
very
sense,
good way to put it.
Yeah. So whenever you have something, in fact, it's funny because we have developed, right, through our psychological framework and our model of reality, more so in the West, or in kind of call it modern civilization, in a more of sort of reductionist leaning mentality, we look at things in terms of their parts and of their molecules, and if we can isolate it in the lab and look at it and whatnot. But it's funny because the indigenous people wouldn't see it that way. Yeah. They would describe the exact same experience, like if they're describing the Kava experience is what I'm doing right now, and I'm kind of going like half and half, like the scientific lens and then also kind of like the experiential lens as well too. But they would use it in terms of like energy, and they would say like how that's manifesting, and you're describing the same freaking thing.
I know.
That's it's like. And again, that's why I always kind of say, language can be so divisive. Yeah. It's ridiculous, right? I think this happens. I mean, I would go as far as, I could get, of course people would fight me on this, but I think that's what happens in a lot of, religious circles as well too, is like you're talking about the same thing. You want the same thing. You want the same goals. All sensible people actually want the same thing. But no, we get so obsessed with the methodology. which includes the language, the sounds that we make with our mouth that then get decoded by your brain, like I'm doing right now. You know what I mean? And you're saying, well, I don't use those sounds, but I really want the same thing. But because you use different sounds, let's go to war, you know, or something. You know what I mean? And it's like that. It's like, well, it's in the method. The power is in the method. It's kind of like saying, you know, like, you know, looking at a TV and be like, oh, dude, The Price is Right is in that box. You know, it's like, no, it's not in the box. Like, that's the method. It's like the delivery system for it or whatever, you know? Gosh, that's going to date me. The Price is Right. Jeez.
No, you're so dead on. It's like language is, I always say that too. Like the vocabulary is just, it constrains us significantly from like, I mean, you actually think that like, you know, if we could make up words for different feelings and emotions and expressions, then we might have some more liberty, right? But I can't just like, you know, come to you and just say, hey, you know, Cameron, I feel hushabilibit.
Yeah.
You know, and like, what does that mean? You know, it's just like, we're limited, we're constrained by this. And that means that we have a finite number of like boxes that we can check, or a finite number of things that we can like interface like with other people, other cultures, because we're limited by, you know, it's wild. But when you realize like at the end of the day, it's this infinite amount of energy and expressive, you know, thought, emotion, whatever, that sometimes works better if you actually just dumb it down back to energy.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because that's kind of more of a universal language that even though a lot of people don't like speaking that language, because maybe they've just kind of become a little bit of a science troll to the degree of like they think this language is the only way that gives credibility to any experience in humanity or whatever. But at least they know that there's a reality to that. There's an energetic reality at the framework of everything, and that at least plays out energetically in people. But like, that's why I always like whenever, you know, telling any, you know, exploring anything, there's you know, there's different ways, you know, there's different angles to express it and explain it in different languages, basically, right? And different ways of kind of like looking at it. And there's also different forms of evidence that can support any narrative as well, too, right? It's like, you know, today we're in the world and in the age where it's like we've almost, you know, created a separate religion about the obsession of exclusively what we think is the scientific method. A lot of times it becomes like if you've heard like the term Scientism, you know, where you get kind of dogma that's like, and there's nonsense that surrounds like the actual pure scientific method, where people just like make assumptions on things that actually have not, like, you don't even question the base of where that evidence came from. And you just say, well, the science is settled and all this kind of stuff, you know, as if that's even like a thing, if that's the most not anti-science thing you've ever heard. But you know what I mean? Like that's, you know, where that's the only form of evidence is double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized trials and all that kind of stuff. It's like, and it's like, no, that's a great, you know, scientific method is incredible. The scientific method is incredible for creating objective measurements and protocol, and to be able to, you know, use mathematics to kind of like point out these plots on things, and to actually like to tell a good part of the story and demonstrate it visually, you know, and to say, look, the numbers add up here, da da da. The problem is you can never account for all variables, because reality is like freaking infinite, and it's more complex than we have instruments to be able to, observe and calculate things. So it's like, there's also just experience, right? And so it's funny because like after spending so much time with Indigenous people, like, you know, Polynesians, like with the, you know, sake of this discussion, for example, on Kava, but this goes for many other things too, is there's so much wisdom and there's so much knowledge of things that they know. They don't use our language to describe it. And a lot of people look at them and tell them that they're stupid. They don't know what they're talking about. And look, does that have a blah clinical trials at blah? They're like, dude, we've been using it for 3,000 years, man. Yeah. And I could tell you more about this, you know, substance than, than a brand new experimental synthetic molecule that has a cohort of obvious side effects and all that, which is just something that at its base, you take things back to kind of your first principles, difference between plant medicines and like, synthetic drugs. Most synthetic drugs, all of them essentially have a robust like side effect profile. We call them side effects, which are really the effects of the molecule, right? Yeah. They're just adjacent effects. But that happens from the fact that we're isolating single molecules that don't actually occur in a biological system, that weren't orchestrated by the same intelligence that runs our body. Yeah. So you're just basically creating, you might be able to override or map out one system and optimize for one set of metrics, but it's going to be at the cost of others to some degree. And better drugs are ones that have like less downstream costs, right? Than like something that like destroys your life in a weekend, like or something like that. If you it's like you can wreck it pretty fast. But optimize for certain metrics, the cost of others. And the reason is because they're not part of that biological system. They're isolated dead molecules that, again, that don't. So there's substances that a lot of times end up long-term, especially dosage dependent, contradicting and undermining the substrate intelligence of the body that everything in your body works off of, creating kind of noise. And at the end of the day, people like, Zach Bush have become, well known for saying this, is that all disease is really like loss of communication at the cellular level. You can characterize it as that. And whenever you interfere with the communication system and those sequences, all the biochemical sequence inside every single cell in the body, and the body is, essentially like a dish of 30 trillion. You look in the mirror and you think you're an individual, but really you're a community of 70 trillion cells that are flying in flock like a flock of birds, like perfectly in tandem. And they're jacked into some kind of an energetic field that we know that it's like that there's that collective memory. So there's all kinds of theories for it, but where it's like they're there, and there's a communication field. It's like they're jacking into a Wi-Fi, and that's like the intelligence that's there. There's some sort of field there. And that allows for the intercommunication of that community to be able to fly together without like talking to each other in the same way. But any kind of external, like isolated molecule that's not sort of co-developed by an intelligence doesn't talk to enough steps in the biochemical sequence. Because like when you talk about even like cellular function or biochemistry, it's kind of like the steps in like an assembly line, right? There's a sequence of things that's happening, right? And a lot of times, like you take an isolated molecule and it skips several. It's like going into a factory and going halfway down the line and pulling something off the line so you can have it now or something, And the problem is that you get that thing now, but at the cost of now they have to adapt and redirect and try to account for that. And a lot of times you get all this downstream, kind of like like a computer virus or something. You put in a line of code here to get something, it slows the whole thing down over time. So your body is amazing at adapting, but that's like, it's the difference. That's why plant pharmacology is always a great place to start, because you're dealing with something that is like a whole food, in a sense, right? And if it's adapted to be compatible with humans, to where a good solid relationship in relation to that, kind of like I was saying earlier, as far as I look at bringing a plant medicine into your life, kind of like developing a relationship. It's like developing a relationship with people. Like some people are co-adapted with the characteristics and wired in a way that make them very compatible for a consistent daily relationship, to where it breeds health over time by doing that. And some people, you can only help in a healthy way, kind of be around them every once in a while, and you get something therapeutic. But if you're around them all the time, then it's not really a fit. That's like the difference between a substance like psilocybin, right? Where it's like if you used it every single day, it's not one of those medicines that's not going to lead to imbalances if you were to just take macrodoses of psilocybin every day, right?
Totally, man.
And then Kava is one of those that, and I'm using language, it's a slightly different language, shifting back and forth, but a language that Indigenous people in Polynesia would use, as far as they see Kava as a sacred sacrament, basically, that is the foundation of their entire social and even economical, fabric of their culture, right? And that's why they use it for so many contexts, is because they see it as a facilitator, as a technology, basically, for developing the human psyche, a tool for transformation, and a tool for vision and developing a person's emotions, and for connection. They think that it's like the glue. They kind of see Kava as a substance that allows them as a cohesive unit, just like cells in the body, to be able to get on the same page and to connect the collective environment.
And who doesn't go to one of these Polynesian places and say, these people are so happy?
Yeah.
Right? Even when they don't have much, right? And like, people might come from America and be like, oh, they don't have all this infrastructure that we have. They don't have all this money that we have. And at first they might turn their nose up at it. And then you realize, like, these people are happy at the core.
Yeah.
Like, they really are, man. Like and I mean, like, not like every day of their life, they're just like, oh, I'm on cloud nine. But I mean, there is just like, there's not this manufactured stress. Like, it's really not. Right. And it's like, so no matter, like, someone from, depending on which lens you look at the world, it's like, most people that I've talked to, they don't go there and say, like, I never want to be like those people. Most people were like, man, I wish I had
more of this.
I wish I could live like that. And it's not because they're come on, like, we all know that you're pulling a geographic if you think that, I think that's what they call in like 12-step program. They call it pulling a geographic, right? Where you say, like, as soon as I get out of like as soon as I get out of XYZ,
Right.
it's going
I'd
to
be
solve
happy
all
too
my
if I
problems.
was on a beach or
Yeah,
something.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's not that. No, because you're bringing you with you.
Yes.
Okay. So like,
I know plenty of miserable people that live on beaches.
yes. Most people that I know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, it's not that because a lot of them never even left the island. So they are,
Yeah.
they don't know anything else. Like that island, that beautiful beach, they're probably like, oh man, nice to see the mountains sometimes. You know?
Yeah.
So that doesn't matter. They are just happy being because they're not chasing something. They're not always chasing this, you know. And I don't know the literal why, but the point is like, again, I can speak for myself. I've never met someone that hasn't like gone to one of those places and been like, these people are just I wish I had some of that.
And I would hypothesize that a huge component of it is connection. Not only connection between individuals, but I think just being connected to yourself, connected to the source of where your intelligence comes from, of what you are, which is an extension of the natural ecology, say, you know, connection to nature. I have this term that I use that I just, hypothesis, I think that it kind of accurately characterizes or diagnoses most of the neuroses, diseases, and degenerative circumstances that exists that, you know, in the world today, all the psychological, emotional, and, you know, physical illnesses. And of course, you get into the, you know, into the nitty gritty of degree and stuff, but I call it nature divorcement syndrome, you know, and it's basically degrees of separation from us in the collective substrate intelligence that creates, that creates, sustains, and well, sustains life, basically, right? You know, it creates, modulates, and sustains every aspect of our life. And anything that actually works that's therapeutic to heal a person and to maintain health is feeding and amplifying the innate intelligence and or removing interference that's inhibiting the intelligence. And so, but that doesn't just mean in the ecology of your body, because your body is an extensive, you know, it's classic, you know, Alan Watts philosophy, you know, like if people are like apples on a tree, like we're extensions of like that thing, call it what you want. Again, language is divisive, right? But there is a collective intelligence. Earth is a living, breathing organism. There's no question about it. And we're individual units of life in the same way that neurons in our brain are individual units of our collective organism. It's like that idea of as above, so below, or macrocosm, microcosm kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, it's, yeah, so my main point, going back to nature divorcement syndrome, right? So it's basically the degrees of separation, how I characterize it, the degrees of separation between us and that the collective base ecological intelligence that creates, maintains, and sustains life inside of our bodies and you know, life in general. And I think that what I mean is, you know, degrees of separation is that, and we all know this because the whole biohacking movement, the whole regenerative medicine movement, the whole MAHA movement, they're all predicated on this underlying sensible sort of nature reintegration premise, you know, to most degree, right? Even a lot of the technologies are, you know, whether it be PEMF mats or whether it be hyperbaric oxygen chambers or whether it be light therapy, they're technologies that are capturing different aspects that we're deficient in from nature and trying to, you know, deliver them either in more of a concentrated, acute context, you know, to give you kind of like leverage over your disease process, like red light therapy or infrared light therapy, you know, giving you what's automatically like exists in the sun, right? But giving it to you that particular wavelength, you know, 650 nanometers or whatever it is, 820, you know, to get that acute boost of the mitochondria to kind of give you a short-term therapeutic effect, usually because you're deficient to some degree or there's some degree of deterioration or imbalance or dyshomeostasis that's occurring in the body. And even like with the MAHA movement, what's the key, you know, predication of the MAHA movement? Really, a lot of what the MAHA movement has become, regardless of what, you know, political affiliation or the idea behind it or people getting behind it or just the, you know, the desire behind it, is it's a sort of a relook at our relationship with synthetic chemicals in our environment, our food. That's the whole like RFK thing, right? You know, it's like, all the lawsuits against Monsanto for glyphosate and all of that, but you know, food additives, dyes, colorings, these are all like synthetic chemicals that are not part of our biology. They're not, you know, generated. They're those dead molecules that we were talking about to some degree and things that create levels of interference. And because we're exposed to 70, 80 and up, 1,000 of them in everything that we eat and breathe and everything, and there's this principle of bioaccumulation where they accumulate in the body, that is that is one form of nature divorcement syndrome, right? Obviously, but also living in artificial environments under artificial lights, or even, it's not just, when I say nature divorcement syndrome, I don't mean just, that whole idea of like not going camping enough or not actually physically like being out, because nature is all around us, right? It's inside of us, it's in our bodies, and, the more distortions that we create, or layers of processing. That's why processed food, the idea of a processed food, like what is that? And I don't look at all processed food as the same, because there's layers of processing, right? Because you could consider a protein powder a processed food, right? To some degree. But obviously, it's like I was talking about with Kava. Whenever you get it as its living organism form with like its top degree of biological compatibility, it's going to give you, nourishing and therapeutic results, up into the future. But the more that you process it, there are consequences to doing that, right? It loses its intelligence. It loses its therapeutic capacity to communicate and to synergize with the body, right? So not all substances become toxic whenever you isolate them, depending on their composition and what they are and everything, or become inherently toxic. But usually their safety profile starts to lessen, and usually their therapeutic efficacy lessen as far as its ability to sustain you over time. I mean, everybody knows that you can't live off of taking a multivitamin, right? You need that whole food matrix. You need the macronutrient, component. Obviously, there's in food, there is no replacement for food because it is that complete organism, and you can supplement different things in, but they can be supplemental and they can be beneficial short term. But I think just as a general principle, anything that really works to either make the body stronger in a state of just trying to increase performance, or to try to recover from a serious chronic degenerative disease process, involves some level of nature reintegration. It doesn't matter if you're using technologies to mimic it, or if you're physically going outside of nature. We know everything from grounding to sunlight, everything in all these movements is all talking about nature reintegration. So I say that because it's even with our medicines, right? One of my lanes is kind of talking about, one of the talks that I do is sort of what are the next 5 to 10 years going to look like? The landscape going to look like in a world kind of beyond our sole reliance on alcohol and pharma for elevated mental and emotional states and for social bonding, human connection, recreational environments, all that kind of stuff, right? And really, there's a whole cohort within all these movements that all these different movements, like I said, rise of regenerative medicine, biohacking, organic food movement, all that kind of stuff. People have this underpinning desire for these things, but it's all these treatments, therapies, rituals, strategies, compounds that are slowly moving the culture away from that sole reliance on that old exclusive model of overriding the body with isolated molecules that are patentable and structured through that sort of religious, exclusive, quote unquote scientific, section of our reality.
For sure, man. If I pivot a little bit on mechanism stuff, is there any come down from Kava, or does it wildly depend on the type? Do you have a rebound?
So that's one thing that's, and again, kind of going back to its receptor upregulation, its your reverse tolerance effect, the way that it kind of is adaptogenic to some degree, even different than a classic adaptogen, that it has a short-term acute therapeutic effect. But that's one thing that's so unique about it pharmacologically, and I think that layers into its protective identity as well, right? You were talking about components that it kind of protects you from, on the psychological and emotional side of things, right? From being opened up to certain things while expanding your mind. But it also has a lot of protective mechanisms that, communicate to multiple different steps in that biochemical sequence that kind of help to reestablish homeostasis after its use. So basically, there really is no come down from Kava. I've never seen a clinically relevant come down symptom, even from high doses of Kava, because even like I told you before, there's that afterglow effect, the next day. And what tends to happen is that you get this natural elevation of dopamine, GABA, even serotonergic and cholinergic activity as well. And it goes up, and the acute elevation of it, obviously, that's just active in the system, tends to slowly titrate down depending on, again, if there's double bonded lactones, more of those present, sometimes 24 to 48 hours, right? But it tends to tail off, and afterwards, your baseline, like for example, when I first started using Kava, long story short, I was in a really, really bad, from a clinical standpoint, disastrous situation, right? An autoimmune condition. I was sick for over a decade. It's how I got into this work. It's what drives me. It's the reason why I do what I do and all that. But I went on this long odyssey to, the pharmaceutical model failed for me. It almost killed me. I went down that whole road. I was on, ridiculous cocktails, Adderall, benzodiazepines, all that kind of stuff. It was disastrous on my life, my circumstances. Got sick from any number of different, confounding variables and factors, plus my genetic susceptibility. It's kind of like an equation. But I had a perfect storm of a situation that allowed me to kind of be one of these canary in the coal mine type of people. I got sick before things really started to explode in the culture, and it's going more in that direction as far as chronic disease, autoimmune conditions and stuff. But I developed a neurotoxic illness, what I would call a neurotoxic, like autoimmune spectrum illness, meaning just like when I think about chronic inflammation, I think of chronic irritation, and autoimmune disease. So like being consistently irritated by foreign molecules in the environment and things that are priming and driving inflammation and stuff. But anyways, so I ended up in this situation where I was basically in this bad autoimmune situation, and I had all kinds of neurological deterioration. I got, I did, Daniel Amen, SPECT brain imaging scans, and the radiologist said this scan looks a lot like my 80-year-olds with dementia kind of thing. Like it was like post drugs and all that kind of stuff, mold illness and everything too. But I ended up in the situation where I was like, I didn't walk for 2 years. I was like a shell of a human being. I was basically on my deathbed. I was in ICU, and I developed so many sensitivities to everything in my environment that almost everything that I would eat would put me into an anaphylactic reaction or like into a seizure. I was having like 10 seizures a day at one point. So again, that's kind of how I got into Kava. I met an Indigenous Islander from the South Pacific whenever we were traveling around, engaging in our medical tourism, and he we didn't talk about Kava or anything, but he recontacted me later on asking me about something else. And I told him I was on these heavy doses of benzodiazepines, and I was in a horrible situation trying to find some off ramp from them. He asked me if I'd tried Kava. I said, yeah. And then I said, the capsules, all that kind of stuff. And he laughed and told me that's not real Kava. And I was like, that makes sense, because all that anthropological literature and everything that I'd written about didn't seem to line up with that. And so he sent me some fresh frozen, like ceremonial, like really potent strains, and I started to use it. And I say all that because over the first the first time I actually took Kava in the vulnerable state that I was in, I actually didn't feel it. I used it a couple times, but after using high dosages of it for about a week and a half, all of a sudden I woke up like one morning, or it kind of happened a little bit gradually, but after, a couple mornings of waking up feeling more stable, I just was not having these convulsions anymore. And they were ruling my life. Like it was like operating in a minefield all day long. Like anything could induce one of these, and they were just like torturing my body to death. It was horrific. So I was on these high doses of benzodiazepines like Klonopin and things like Depakote and these anticonvulsant type of drugs. But I was still having them because tolerance ensued, and now I was getting all the same reactions and convulsions, but I was on these drugs. Then if I took the drugs away, they lost their effectiveness. If I took the drugs away, then seizure threshold would go down, and it would be lethal, because I went like a really long period of time without eating or drinking, almost 12 days without water, actually. And I was dying from dehydration for sure. Like I became very, very, very freaking close. I was getting IV fluids for part of that time and stuff, but anyways, after the first about week and a half, I just wasn't having these convulsions anymore, which was like a medical miracle for me. Like it literally was just like, I fell in love with this stuff immediately. Wasn't expecting to get that off of it, but it reduced the reactions that I was having to things that I was eating and drinking, because it stabilized that limbic, that nervous system, and that autoimmune response that I was having. Which I think was highly driven by people that are in these reactive syndrome, these sensitivity syndromes. There's a lot of this overactivation of NMDA receptor pathways and chronic microglial activation and all this stuff that's going on. And it's just after about a week and a half, once the buildup, the reverse tolerance thing built up, it was like I just got like 48 hours of freedom from these strains where I could eat anything that I wanted to, and all of a sudden, like I got out of that because I could eat and drink water again. So it's not like Kava was like a magic pill that's like did everything for me or something, but it was a tremendous leverage tool that did that. But what I realized though was, in relation to your initial question, was that whenever I first started using it, those effects crescendoed. So you go through the reverse tolerance, and generally what we see clinically is that it tends to go from about 2 weeks to a month and a half to maybe like 8 weeks where people hit their peak of what Kava is going to do for them. And whenever you take Kava away from someone, and this is really relevant whenever, like I was using it as part of a benzodiazepine tapering protocol, I was able to get off benzos successfully within about a month and a half to 2 months, which after being on them for years, that's a successful freaking event because people a lot of times will spend a year and a half trying to safely taper off benzos. And benzos are one of those drugs that the withdrawals can kill you if you were to go off them cold turkey and you're fragile enough. But they'll just bring you to hell if this, you know what I mean? It's like you ricochet in the opposite direction. You have seizures, you can have heart attacks, all kinds of stuff. But anyways, I layered the Kava and then was able to titrate down the benzo. And what I noticed after using it for a couple months, starting to experiment at lowering the Kava dose, not only did I not get a rebound effect, because that's something that I was concerned about. I was like, is this just like, switching one habituation for another? And I kind of knew that that wasn't going to be the case, but even if it was slightly the case, I was pretty fragile. So I was cautious to say the least. But as I started to titrate it down, not only did I not get a rebound effect, but my baseline, even I could take Kava away after like 3 or 4 months of using it, and my baseline, I wasn't having these reactions anymore, these limbic system driven nervous system reactions, which if you talk about like chemical or food sensitivities, like that kind of situation I was in, it's autoimmune, but if you ever heard of like Gulf War syndrome or environmental illness, it's like an extreme form of PTSD where driven by neurotoxins and different things. But anyways, so I think it's acting on the limbic system and everything, but and then after that, we started using it in the doctors network that I started working with, a couple thousand functional medicine doctors. We started immediately, some of the doctors that I was working with kind of saw the results I was getting and was like, had me start to put together just like, protocols for their patients to kind of choose to use themselves or whatever, because every chronically ill, patient that, most of these physicians had, stress was an underlying component. If it not was, of course it's driving it, stressors drive illness, but also it's just an outgrowth of the illness. Like people are just paralyzed a lot of times by their chronic illness. If they have a chronic illness of any time, it's hard to even get them to comply with all of the little things that are actually going to get them well: exercise, nutrition, sleep, mindset, detoxification. So they wanted me to start to build these different just general protocols for people to try and use. And we ended up duplicating those effects in people that were coming off of benzodiazepines, like time and time again. And not only do we not actually see like a rebound effect like ever, like anything that I've ever seen that's, clinically significant that wasn't like a highly exacerbated or a highly fragile individual that had some sort of pre-existing something where they had a reaction to the Kava itself, like a mast cell reaction, or, those are few and far between, but that happens with just about everything. But I didn't see rebound effects, and, generally the baseline tends tends to be more balanced over time whenever you take it. So, what I just noticed was that it wasn't only like giving me the short-term therapeutic effect, but it was kind of working underneath the hood, to upregulate and to sort of, solidify your biochemical framework, and your limbic system. So yeah, I've personally never witnessed it in any meaningful way, a rebound effect, either acutely from like a heavy night of Kava. Definitely not there, because you get the afterglow effect and then it tapers off and then you're just kind of back to normal. Even in the Kava community of like, tons of just experiential was what we hear and see all the time, thousands of people. That's just something that that's one reason why people just fall in love with Kava. Yeah. Is just because it has like one of the greatest therapeutic effect to drawback ratios of any like potent plant medicine, right, that I've used, right? It's not like there are some medicines that are stronger in certain categories, there's some that are weaker in certain categories, but as far as like giving you short-term therapeutic relief and long-term modulation and long-term like kind of adaptogenic and therapeutic or like nutritive type of effects, it's like jacking up the car and working underneath the hood at the same time. It's got such a good safety profile whenever you source it correctly and use the right parts of the plant and all that. It's hard to, where you can go wrong is with using, poorly sourced material, usually where unscrupulous farmers will sell, whole parts of the plant. They'll sneak like leaves and stems in some of the bushels that come out and get sold to brokers, and then suppliers that don't have like their own supply chain like we do. They just like start a small operation, a Kava bar or something like that, and they're just buying from a broker that everything comes in bushels. They don't know. It's just a conglomeration of different strains, and it's basically just, oh, this is Kava root, you know. And it's anything from Baragu to Mellow Mellow, or then those are all strains of Kava that are popular in the South Pacific. But yeah, so they don't know what they're getting as far as effects profile. That's why people will go to a Kava bar and be like, well, I felt a lot of mental clarity, and it was like euphoria this one time, and then the next time it put me to sleep, or like I felt sick to my stomach one time that I used it, you know. And a lot of times it can easily be contaminated by mold. There's a starch content to it and everything, especially if they're not, you know, filtering that out. And bacteria as well too. So obviously, you know, microorganisms, but also industrial contamination. That's one big problem with Kava coming out of Fiji is glyphosate. I mean, there's pesticides that are used. Yeah. I mean, Vanuatu is essentially pesticide free. It's not even allowed there. So that's one, you know, advantage of that. So obviously there's those contamination issues that can cause, but then also strain selection and the right parts of the plant, you know, making sure that you don't get any leaves and stems. So like, you know, we test it when it comes in the United States just to to demonstrate. You can do a chlorophyll test to assert that it doesn't have any leaves or stems in it. And the leaves and stems, they contain kavalactones and actives, but they also contain plant defense alkaloids. There's one called pipermethystin that's pretty provocative. And even then, its danger is it's not. Like there are areas like in the South Pacific, like Tonga, that they actually use the leaves acutely. You know, they use them for certain things, but especially to a digestive tract that's not adapted to that at all, they can be pretty darn provocative. And the problem really comes in where if you get unscrupulous material where you get like leaves and stems mixed in there with all the plant defense alkaloids, and then you do solvent extractions that then hyper concentrate those alkaloids, you know, then you end up with something that's no more Kava than is coca tea, and you know what I mean? Sure. So now you're in a different situation. So you can't call that Kava. And that's one of the biggest things, right? You know, and that's what led to miscommunication around this whole idea of the association of Kava and hepatotoxicity.
This is going to be my next question. And because I want to talk about the liver toxicity effect. And I also want to make a note too that I'll link out to True Kava down below too, because I think this is something you guys are in a lot of retail stores. You guys are like, this is something I've been using since, I guess it was 2020, right? When I first met you. So it was something that I legit recommend. It's the only Kava, and I've used Kava at Kava bars, and I've gotten exactly what you have said, where like a mast cell reaction, where I actually get like, so like, who knows, but like super sneezy, super weird, super like, and that doesn't happen with True Kava, which is interesting. So it's like, I don't know if that's a mast cell thing or if it's just a purity thing, who knows, right? But anyway, so that's all linked out down below as well. So awesome, just for people to check
exactly.
out.
And that's why I got into this, honestly. I mean, I got into this is definitely we call it pain to purpose, right? It wasn't like, I didn't just set out to like start a company to sell product. It wasn't sales focused at all. It was literally like an authentic the whole True Kava project. And then even, what we're doing with the Kava Coalition, which is, purely research and advocacy. It really was a natural outgrowth of my own, process back to health, and something that I serendipitously came across, and trying to facilitate that into the culture. And I fully believe in the medicine, and it kind of set out from the beginning, before we ever actually even developed a product line. It was kind of an educational and advocacy campaign to integrate Kava into Western culture in the way that it exists in the South Pacific. And then the products are just a natural outgrowth of that, because they just didn't exist in a form that were practical. You didn't have to prepare and squeeze, that actually tastes good and that you could actually trust. Because like, it is one of those things, the devil is literally in the details. Like, not all Kava is created equal. So it's like, when someone says Kava is this or Kava is that, first you have to be, okay, what are you talking about, right? Is the preparation? Is it these strains? Is it this, is it actually, does it meet the definition? Or is it a Kava-like product that you can't necessarily blame Kava if something goes wrong?
So like the people that talk about Kava being liver toxic, like that is, like when it's in its whole true form, there's not evidence of that.
Correct. Yeah. So like I said before, we start kind of a base, base principles, just general sensibility, right? Here's a medicine that's been used as a food by 90% of the population in countries like Vanuatu for 3,000 years. They use it daily, right? And they fully embraced it by their culture. This was never a narrative ever until like the early 2000s. And it all stems basically from one or like a cluster of circumstances that happened in Germany and Switzerland, where basically an unscrupulous pharmaceutical company. I won't name them, but out of Germany, and then there were some in Switzerland as well too that were partnering with them. They constructed a series of studies where they were dealing with a compound that was no more kava than is the coca tea. So they didn't account for any of the major variables that constitute kava. And what they were trying to do is they were trying to develop and patent kavain or kavalactone isolates, so they were bringing it through these different trials and stuff. And of course they didn't control for variables of like susceptibility. A lot of the people in the study were ex-alcoholics with depleted liver enzymes and all that, or high liver enzymes. And a lot of people on high dose acetaminophen and everything. It was basically like a perfect storm of negative circumstances. And so they were dealing with a substance that again was no more like, kava that is, the coca medicine or caffeine anhydrous powder is that. Actually, the most, similar, correlation as far as what has happened that was a disastrous sort of wishy-washy was a situation that happened with tryptophan in the early 90s. I don't know if you remember this. You remember this? Okay, so tryptophan was taken off the market in the early 90s. So you guys can look this up. And actually, for several years, and it kind of, some of the language around it kind of, simmered and existed for several years after that, where even you'd go to a health food store and ask the person like, well, there's like, I don't know if you should take tryptophan or not because of this and that. And it basically was one company that, created a bad batch of, tryptophan that had some neurotoxins in it, right? It was a quality control type of thing. And then it led to this blowback reaction on the marketplace that led to a temporary banning of tryptophan. It was all fleshed out as a quality control issue. And essentially the bans were lifted and it sort of went away. But it was weird, some people call conspiracy because it was like, it directly coincided with like the release of Prozac, like the first serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Okay, so you could say that. And honestly, there is, and again, I'm not, it's like that idea of the difference between a conspiracy theorist and just a conspiracy realist in a situation of like, emergent behaviors, people who have, incentives in a certain incentive structure, obviously to push interests that benefit them, whether or not it's all orchestrated or not. Like there's around this whole situation with kava in Germany and Switzerland, it kind of happened like at that time where the kava market was exploding. And of course, it goes against the whole sort of benzodiazepine industry and all that, and there's alcohol and everything too. But even just to stick to exactly what happened. So basically, it led to a big scare. It got a bunch of press, and there were isolated circumstances, and it led to this knee-jerk reactive banning of kava in Germany, and is basically just based on that. Just the fact that Germany decided to ban kava for that period of time, it led to like, countries all over the world just referencing that one event, never mind the entire history of safe usage of kava and looking at context and all that kind of stuff. And so you had countries all around the world. I mean, US never banned kava. The FDA at the time issued a disclaimer around it. It's basically like, well, we don't know, but, maybe want to be careful kind of thing.
Is it legal in Germany now?
Yes. Yeah. So the ban was lifted back in 2014. This happened in 2002. And this whole thing was fleshed out in the German administrative courts, and a doctor, his name is Dr. Matthias Schmidt. He's kind of, a savior in the world of kava in that sense. Him and Vincent LeBeau and this a couple other guys like Ralph Tesch and stuff were involved in this whole process of fleshing these things out in the German, because that kind of set the precedent for the world. Like everything kind of came back to this whole thing. And it was all flushed out and exactly kind of what happened. And then the ban was lifted. The courts ruled that it was that this is a quality control issue, that kava has a 3,000-year history of safe usage and whatnot. But the problem is, even those bans were lifted, and virtually every country around the world that previously had bans on kava has lifted them, with the exception of like the UK still has some stuff, but they just kind of grandfather kava in under like a gray area, and they're just from a regulatory standpoint, it's not like it's really banned. Like you can use it, you can't import it in large amounts and different things like that. And we're working through some of that with the Kava Coalition in the EU, but yeah, so even though all that was dialed back, it's like once the cat's out of the bag, now it's like guilty till proven innocent. And now people come in it with this whole, because FDA had to release a disclaimer based on that, and then this whole thing, and then insurance companies take forever to even like, they still have this characterization of it and stuff. And so it's basically just like a Google thing where, people say X, Y, and Z. There was that, and then there was one, there was one NTP study, National toxicity program study that did something similar and, you know, goofed up almost in the exact same way and basically just recreated what they kind of did in Germany. And, you know, they found some elevated liver enzymes and whatnot. So, but then you look at like the, there's lots. I mean, as far as the literature on Kava, and it's used for, you know, depression, anxiety, and studies it out like that. This big study that was published in 2013 in the Journal of Clinical Psychopharmacology, this KADSS study, this Kava anxiety depression spectrum study, significant reductions. It was, you know, randomized controlled trial, and, you know, dependency, you know, versus control group, not dependency, anxiety, in the control trial. And they did all of these monitoring on liver enzymes and different things like that. No negative adverse events, you know, came up in this study and versus any other, you know, study that used aqueous preparations of Kava. And even aqueous preparations are not fully traditional, because if you water extract something, even though, you know, traditional preparation water extracted, you're still like concentrating it down and putting it in a tablet, drying, putting it in a tablet. So there's some components there that we're working on some stuff with the Kava Coalition that I'm part of, you know, on mapping out a full chemical fingerprint to, you know, differentiate the, you know, the difference between traditionally prepared Kava and all extracts, which has actually already, you know, kind of happened. So after that, you know, German administrative court ruling, and then, you know, after that, there was a full assessment that was done at the WHO about 2010-ish, 2010 to 2014, and the Codex Alimentarius Commission, which is a subsidiary of the FAO and the WHO. You know, at the time, you know, as many problems as there are with that organization, they did a full assessment of everything that happened with Schmidt, all that stuff, and, you know, basically ruled that, you know, Kava is a generally very safe medicine, been used for 3,000 years, and, you know, like, you know, basically a similar ruling, and there's that documentation as well too. But a handful of us in the industry that, you know, people involved actually with the coalition now, you know, put together a proposal for an international quality standard back years ago around that time, and, you know, submitted it to the WHO to get an international quality standard solidified that you know, differentiates traditionally prepared Kava from Kava-like products or extracts, exactly everything that I laid out. And it was adopted actually in early 2020. And so now it's this kind of thing as the FDA want to officially get behind it, but it is like the world standard of, like, you know, traditional food grade Kava and Kava as a food, right? And we're actually using this and all of its built up, you know, anthropological evidence and some tox studies that we're conducting to update things, to put everything at a gold standard level with the coalition. We're pursuing the GRAS route right now too, with one of the top regulatory consulting firms. It's just something that we're doing for Kava, which is like, you know, True Kava is like the products and everything, but a lot of the Kava Coalition stuff is for Kava. But we're, you know, pursuing the GRAS route. It's kind of a complicated thing, but the expert opinion of like a couple of the top regulatory consulting firms like AIBMR in the country, like we have an expert opinion report creating a summary of all of this evidence, and basically their professional opinion, the same one that we use to pitch to Whole Foods and all these others, is that Kava as it exists in the way that we're preparing it as a traditionally prepared food is classified as a food, even though generally, like, Kava as it existed as a supplement was grandfathered in under the Deshay Act in 1994 in the US. And so it's kind of been looked at as a supplement, you know, kind of, and I would say that the extracts fall into that category, but we're looking to solidify that more and more to give us layers and layers of protection. But just like coffee is a food, even going through the GRAS process, like fully solidifying it as that, you know?
No,
so that's basically it. And so it's, long story short, traditionally prepared Kava as a food has never been shown to be hepatotoxic whenever you account for these quality control variables, if you use what we call noble cultivars as well. Which, you know, noble cultivars are a series of strains. They're like the main 200 strains that I described. There's a series of other cultivars that are closer to Kava's wild progenitor called Kava weishmanii, Piper weishmanii, not Piper methysticum. And, you know, Piper methysticum took, you know, thousands of years ago, they took weishmanii and they kind of like, they bred strains that were a little bit more domesticated, kind of like turning a gray wolf into like a German Shepherd, you know, to where it was more compatible with the digestive tract. And there are some strains that are closer to wild that a percentage of people will get more stomach upset of.
Yeah.
And they're really strong strains, but they have more of the double bonded lactones, and it doesn't mean that there's inherent toxicity. What it does mean it's hard for them to tolerate. They have more of these flavocavanes as well too, which actually have a lot of therapeutic effects too. And there's a lot of interest in them on the cancer front.
Is that a serotonergic effect in the gut? Is that why it does it? Because similar like a psilocybin and the serotonin receptors in your gut kind of. Or is it just flat out just hard on the gut?
No. I think, well, there's a few components. We know that the double bonded lactones, when you've really high amounts of them, like ones that you never get in these noble cultivars, like really high amounts of them, like that you get in some of these, what they call them 2-day strains, but like they're closer to like wild kavas. They're harder to break down. They just create it. It's not even related to an inherent level of toxicity. It's just whenever you get really high amounts of them, it's just difficult to process, and then your body kicks them out. But then also, it mainly is because in those strains, it's not really as much the double bonded lactones as it is the flavocavanes, which are not the psychoactive constituents. They're medicinal metabolically, and they're medicinal. They've shown all kinds of apoptotic effects on senescent cells and cancers and stuff like that. Because that's partly what chalcones are, is they control cells from going out of control inside the plant, and so you take those and they're therapeutic. But those wild strains have like very high amounts of them, and so they can, if you get really high amounts of them, it's sort of like this. You can get a hormetic effect from them that's highly therapeutic, and they can be very therapeutic, and we need more data on them, but I'm really excited about flavocavanes for a lot of reasons. But you can get to a point where it's not an adaptable stress kind of thing. And then you drink a certain amount. And there's something to be said about just the tannins and root fibers that are just drinking so much plant material. If you drink a lot amount of it, it would happen even if you do it with ginseng, but with kava, people just drink a lot of it, So that's why partly what we did whenever we kind of reinvented the kava experience. It's commercializing everything that we do with True Kava is commercializing the traditional preparation, mechanistically using combination of pressure and water exclusively, no solvent extraction. But then we have a filtration method. It's like lots of trial and error. This is really, really difficult to do, to keep the lactone complex intact and the actives intact as great as you possibly can, but filtering out those excess like plant, like structural tannins and root fibers that can cause stomach upset, So it just makes a more refined experience while not losing the medicine. So it's hard. You want to discard the excess structural stuff that you don't need. Past a certain point, you get a little bit of it in there. So anyways, and then it makes it a lot easier to be able to flavor it, to make it more palatable. So it's not that like muddy texture. So what we want to do is like dissect and get rid of like the muddy taste and texture, but keep that kind of peppery, authentic hue that's there, that kind of kava lactone hue, and the numbing on the tongue. So anyways, that's basically like, but those on the toxicity thing, the main quality control things to account for are going to be the proper strain selection, the proper part of the plant selection, the proper extraction method. So obviously, traditional extracts are going to be the most tried and true, and then you go like ethanol and CO2 that aren't problematic but less effective, and then you go contamination, mold, bacteria, pesticides, all that stuff. And so whenever you do account for those variables, because it's so important, that's why this organization was so important to structures, because you really do need to be like, this is what kava is, and you have to be able to have transparency with it and stuff. But it's shown to be a very, very safe medicine when in that context. So
you mentioned ginseng a couple times, and I'm kind of curious. I don't want to go on a tangent with it, but do you see in those regions, like ginseng's obviously a little further north, I would imagine, right? Like for ginseng, you get into more like but I think Asian is like in this, these like ginseng's in a similar category of something that is like very like in its true, real, like raw root form and its real whole food form is extremely powerful. And when you talk about it, people kind of like give you that side eye a little bit, because it's like, oh, ginseng. Like ginseng is very, and not that I want to like sidebar the conversation on a side quest with ginseng, but I actually think in my experience, there's actually some synergy, not necessarily taking it together, but like ginseng is like activate for me. Like ginseng is sort of like, whereas like kava is more introspection, right? I'm just curious because you've referenced ginseng a couple of times, so it sounds like you might know a little bit about it. I think it's is there a tandem relationship there? And are there any cultures that actually use both?
Well, there's some, actually they use some in like Kava drinking cultures, they access to a lot of these medicines, get them imported and stuff, but it's not like that the South Pacific is a big hive for like ginseng growth or anything.
Yeah.
But there's definitely, it definitely is relevant to the conversation. The reason why I draw the comparisons is just because ginseng is just such a well-known plant medicine that it also is a root that has also been well misunderstood. And to your point, I'm glad that you know about that, because a lot of people don't realize
awesome.
that.
Yeah.
Ginseng is incredible.
Yeah.
Wars have been fought over the land where ginseng grows on, right? And historically, there's a reason why. You talk about medicine that's been tried and true. Our medical system is like 100 years old or so, or a little bit more, and traditional Chinese medicine is 5,000 years old, and they've been curating these medicines. And at its base, they use herbal medicines. They use these plant compounds as its base. And of course, today in China, of course, it's a hybrid of the two. They use pharmaceutical medicine in conjunction, but they see the energy systems of the body, and it's all science-backed. It's like, it's funny because they had 5,000 years of observational experience of observing things in the ecology, and then, testing what they do along, and they map these things out intuitively, but then subject it to the scrutiny of the scientific lens, generations later. And guess what? Most of it held up. It held up, and almost exactly what they were saying, which is fascinating. So I love using that as the split kind of conversation to what we were talking about earlier as well too. But the reason why I reference ginseng is because if you look at like traditional Chinese medicines, like top 5, adaptogenic or plant medicine compounds that's in like almost all formulas. Ginseng and reishi mushroom are at the very, very top. Ho Shou Wu is up there too. Romania is in there. And those are because they're like they're Jing tonics, and ginseng is also what they consider a qi tonic, which basically means that it mobilizes energy immediately in the short term. Cordyceps people know as a qi tonic as well too, but also helps to rebuild and to facilitate mechanisms in your body that rebuilds your body's foundational essence over time. So, but ginseng is one of those things that's funny because ginseng actually, when you get, it's a little bit like kava in the fact that like the longer that it's aged, the more powerful it is. Like there are some, if you go on like the Chinese market, you can find like 100-year-old ginseng that's selling for thousands of dollars, and it ages like, if you can find a place where you have like at least 15-year-old ginseng, and let's just
Matt,
be clear.
in that on that white desk in there, grab that little wooden box. Just keep going.
Yeah. No, it's so like aged wild ginseng is, most people have never had ginseng. Let's just be honest about that. Like, it's most ginseng on the market is counterfeit.
Yeah. It's like
real
Korean, like
yes, exactly, There's Korean ginseng, so Korean ginseng is Panax ginseng, so it's a certain type of ginseng. There's also American ginseng that's more of like a yin tonic. It's less stimulating on the front end. It's more what they would consider a yang tonic, like that. And then there's of course Siberian ginseng, which isn't really a real ginseng, and but it's it has overlapping adaptogenic characteristics. It's called a eleuthero root as well. But anyways, Panax ginseng it's just up there. Whenever you actually source like aged wild ginseng, like I said, wars have been fought over the land, that it's like going ginseng foraging. It's like these things just sell for ridiculous amounts of money. Most ginseng, when people just get in their little formula or whatever that they buy at the store, a lot of it is counterfeit or ginseng that hasn't even been aged long enough to really represent any of the characteristics that made it famous in the first place. It's just a very mild thing. But if you've ever like taken some 20-year-old or 30-year-old root, which I have, and decocted it, kind of like preparing kava traditionally, same principles. It's that whole nature divorcement processing type of thing. And you drink it, like you feel it, like it's like you're like, holy shit. And it even has kind of it's subtly what the Chinese would consider a shin tonic, right? Which is kind of like it has effects on the emotions as well too, not as prominently as like kava or something like that. But when you get some really, really good like aged wild ginseng that's you foraged or bought for really expensive, you feel it, and you'll feel it sometimes for a couple days. And just the modulatory effect that's in its ability to build Jing in the body or build foundational essence and energy. In a lot of the studies,
libido, everything.
Libido. It's been shown to, along with stacking it with things like Ho Shou Wu and Romania and handful of other things. Salvia root and different things. It's a stem cell mobilizer. There's certain forms of it that have effects, because a lot of these things that are Jing tonics have effects on on the bone marrow or mobilizing stem cells from the blood because they help to build blood. So they build your foundational energy, like your battery pack, which starts from the kidneys. Anything that's a kidney tonic usually has effects on, EPO, erythropoietin, which helps hematopoietic stem cell function and red blood cell count. All
so it's so cool because you see it in the performance data with ginseng.
Yes, absolutely. it's so freaking cool. But that goes back to the whole thing of that we were talking about earlier, that these almost like so many of these medicines that we think that we know have a spectrum of quality and efficacy, right? Like that most of what we get at a health food store, unfortunately, and some companies are jumping out. You mentioned a couple of companies we were talking about at the beginning too, before we started, that are doing things at a gold standard level and really trying to go back to what made these individual compounds like famous to begin with and their true medicinal qualities that are there, where the stories come from, right? So like that's why like a lot of these herbs that you read about, you read about them and you're like, wow, these things were like sacred in certain cultures. And then I get a capsule from the store and I'm like, it leads people to believe that like natural compounds are like somewhat fake and it's hype around everything, right? Yeah. And which can exist, and hype does exist in marketing. It's more marketing sometimes than anything, but not with these medicines, not with medicines like Kava, or not like a lot of these things in the Chinese medicine pharmacopoeia. That's like, dude, you have an entire medical system going 5,000 years, and like reishi mushroom and age-wild ginseng was reserved for the emperor and a few of the royals, like for like years and years and years. Like, they didn't even allow anybody because they were rare and they were so valuable, Yeah,
I mean, not to mention even some of like the Newtonian physics that modern medicine is. Still a lot of times stems from some of this stuff, right? Yeah. So it's just like, it's not like, I get frustrated why these two worlds can't communicate, because it's like, there's actually, have other guests on the show, it's like modern medicine is tremendous for like saving your life if you're about to die in many ways.
Acute episodal illnesses.
Exactly. Yeah. If I'm bleeding from a trauma wound, or if I have a major bacterial infection,
give me the antibiotic. I don't want the multivitamin.
Yeah,
the fish
it's like this communication of the two. I think we know why they don't communicate, but I just wish they would.
Well, and also whenever we're constructing studies, a lot of times, not accounting for the right variables, and actually, it's this misunderstanding and trying to treat foods and plant medicines like they're drugs. They're looking for what is the active constituent. As long as I get an extract that has the highest amount or a standardized amount of what has been established as the thing in it. So like with Kava, they would say like there's these 6 Kava lactones, and everything in a lot of the studies that are poorly conducted, or people in industry, they try to say, well, my this and that is the most potent because it's got X amount of milligrams of Kava lactones. It's like, but Kava lactones need activation from the other co-constituents, and you can have an extract with literally 3x the amount of Kava lactones as a traditional prep, and the traditional prep will knock it out of the water. I mean, it's like, it's a completely different experience. It's entourage kind of thing. And so it's just the inability of this framework to communicate and to understand how to examine this framework properly, because then we're going to see a lot better results in a lot of the studies. We still see good, because, the Chinese, whenever they, conduct these things, they understand more. So they like to do the proper, so a lot of the literature on, Chinese medicine, like out of China, is actually pretty impressive, right? And over here we tend to like, use cookie cutter extraction methods and get something that doesn't, like, again, doing studies on ginseng with that you get like in the health food store is like, and not that all of it is bad, but it's definitely nowhere near what it could be. It's just one of those things that like everything, most of these compounds, I think, require, don't just take them at face value whenever you try them once, or think that it's like, oh, I tried this, I tried that. I mean, I made that mistake when my friend told me, have you tried Kava? I was like, I thought I tried it. Immediately when he said it, I understood. I was like, oh, give me the real stuff, please, because I know what you mean by this.
Yeah.
And certainly it changed my life, because it gave me a completely different, effects profile. And that even goes for other therapies that are not like compounds or things that you take as well too, right? I mean, getting something that's unprocessed from nature, that happens to be therapeutic to the body, a natural element or experience in nature and different things, or whole foods of any kind. I mean, obviously, eating whole organs versus, taking, desiccated organ extracts and whatnot, like obviously, convenience, there's a trade-off, and it's not like that they're not beneficial or whatever, but, it's just, trying to, tailor things back and kind of look at, okay, what's been said about this thing, and I want to try what they were talking about. Whenever it was written about initially, and if we examine it, we have to control for these variables, because a lot of times we don't know. It's like with the Kava stuff, like the stuff around the liver toxicity. It's like the tryptophan thing. You guys need to look that up. It's a crazy story with the tryptophan thing. Is like, really, but it's just like we have to agree on what we're talking about when we talk about the material, whether it's effective and whether it's safe.
Yeah,
right. Because I can give you two things that people call Kava, and one, they are about as far apart as any substance can be. Right. Yeah. And that goes with just about just about everything. But it does come down to that. You always try to get it in as close to in its form and when it was living as possible. And if you get it in that form and then you get therapeutically relevant doses of it, then it's really, really interesting and effective. But there's a lot of there are whole segments of the effects profile with Kava that completely are lost whenever you extract them with solvents, like with ethanol. Like, it maintains basically what you take. You take the traditional preparation. When you extract it with solvents, you end up with something with a shade of its anxiety relieving component still in it. It's a mild, like relaxing, like chamomile tea type of thing, but it doesn't have hardly any, if any, at all of its euphoric social lubricant effect. It's metabolic or appetite suppressing effect that makes it good for, like, the people use it for fasting and different things like that. You don't get that reverse tolerance effect. It literally is just a shade of the medicine.
Yeah. I've definitely used it for fasting personally.
Yeah.
And it's just because I don't know. I mean, I've used it for fasting in the sense where I feel like I fast for a lot of reasons. I don't just fast for body composition reasons. I feel like I get closer to source when I fast. Like a lot of reasons. And I found that it helps with that part. It helps with, like, the purity aspect, right?
Yeah.
But side note, yes, it absolutely curbs your appetite. So that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Then if you look at from through like a TCM lens at all, is Kava considered more yang, or is it more of a yin? I mean, because, like, it's kind of, I couldn't really put it in a box either way.
Yeah. Well, and that's, and again, this is, trying to distill everything and have everything exactly categorized, like, under these, like, there's, the Chinese, suffer from that too. Like, they're trying to create a system as well as possible, like putting things as, like, is this primarily yin or is it yang? Is it shin? Is it a jing substance? Is it a qi? And what you end up with is, like, this substance is like a little bit of yin and a little bit of yang, and it's shin, and it's a qi tonic, and it supports all three. It supports all three treasures. It supports all three, all the systems of the body. And then sometimes they kind of teeter more exclusively into one category than the next. So, like, it's not usually an all or nothing type of thing. With some it is. This is like there are some tonics, like a Luthra root Siberian ginseng is pretty strongly a yang tonic, right? It's pretty stimulating. It's very stimulating substance. Cordyceps is kind of like, Jin and Qi and all that. But as far as yin versus yang, that's one thing that's interesting about Kava, is that it absolutely has a very, like we talked about, a very nourishing yin, restorative, recovery, protective, because it improves sleep quality. It definitely enhances recovery. It's a reset for the nervous system. It has so many yin qualities, like restorative yin qualities to it. But it also has a very focused, driven, productive flow, like inspired type of, that energy to it as well. I would say that it's more yin than anything, right? In the sense, because it's probably more protective and restorative, but especially if you get the right strains with more of that sort of Yangonin and Kava content, a lot of those that they've selected, mainly the Tongans have selected for more than anything, that we put a little bit in those products, but that have more of that sort of dopaminergic kick to it. It kind of depends on the strains. Some of the strains, depending on what they've selected for, what the characteristics have tried to express the most, they've grown and planted and replanted.
Yeah.
The ones that express more of that yin quality versus the yang quality. But it overwhelmingly, it's a restorative substance, which yang can be restorative too, but yang is like more like mobilizing your energy at the same time as nourishing it in a lot of cases, as opposed to like a straight stimulant that just kind of depletes, that just mobilizes and like, leads you to withdrawal and stuff, and stimulants, caffeine, etc., or all those substances. but yeah, I would say like overwhelmingly like Kava is more known for its yin qualities for sure. Just because it's like there's so much. A lot of people don't realize this too. Kava is so good from a performance standpoint, because for both of the yin and the yang, qualities that it has, but because it's just its ability to increase like, sleep architecture and, efficiency and all of that and the amount that you recover. I just noticed that forever, but it also helps with like HRV, and it helps the nervous system recover. And I think it's something that's just not talked about like enough, because everybody, obviously, when we talk about compounds for recovery, a lot of it is focused on muscle recovery, right?
It's purely metabolic.
Yes, exactly. And it's like a lot of times it's like, okay, the muscle recovers in X amount of time, but the nervous system, we don't let our nervous systems recover, and then we can't even lift as much, we can't move as much, because I've just noticed that like sometimes like I know that I have recovery, but because I've had long-term, because my nervous system got ransacked, it takes a little longer to recover, because it's been through so much, even though it's super healthy today. But yeah, and so like we have people, we always like stack it with, protein, essential aminos, electrolytes, creatine, like all the the normal stuff. Yeah. But a lot of people like really, that was something that it wasn't like surprising for me, but it wasn't my core focus whenever going into it. But just a lot of athletes like freaking love it. They like it because they can take it any time of day. Sometimes they'll use certain strains or types, more so at night. But then it also is like that. Most of our we decided to create a proprietary blend of strains that kind of sits in the middle of Heady and Heavy, that kind of represents all the best aspects of what makes Kava so lucrative. We use a lot of a strain called Baragu, which is probably the most famous strain in Vanuatu. That's kind of right in the middle of that. Like it represents most of the profile of what alcohol is. So it's not going to be sedative, but it's going to lead to a good sleep. It's not going to be like over the top, like activating, but it's very sort of, usually flow state type of thing. But I've seen, and I think what people like Kava the most for, aside from recovery and stuff, but like is just the mental performance aspect of it, because like I'm pretty sensitive to stimulants because of all my nervous system has been through, and I can have a little bit, but I just got to be really careful with it. It's my limbic system. It's just like, it's really easy for me to get. Plus I'm very, very hyper aware and vigilant of going too far into beta or reactive. Because everything we talked about before, I'm just less effective. I'm less creative. I'm not as good to be around whenever I'm not. And in Kava, a lot of people will use it as a coffee alternative. Some people stack it with coffee because they do compound each other. And if you really are not negatively affected by coffee, it's a great stack, even for the fat burning and all that stuff. But it's just, for me, it's like that. It's that like focused but not wired. It's like calm and centered and present, everything that we've been talking about. But it just feels like, and I know this term is so overused, but like the flow state type of thing.
Yeah, for sure.
It does, because that state where you're just more of yourself, like we have so many people now who use it like, for strategy sessions and boardrooms, right? Let's say everyone's using and drinking Kava. It's one of those things, it's like, it almost is like so hard because it brings about this state that's so desirable and protective, and it's so relevant for the time that we live in, where we have so much sympathetic dominance. Like it's more relevant in our culture. It's relevant for us in ways that the indigenous people don't even see it for, because they don't have those issues. Yeah. But it's like, it's one of those things that has like emerged at this time serendipitously, that's like super amazing for that. But just because of the quality of the state, it's good for so many things that it almost sounds like it's fake or something. You know what I mean? Like it's just, because it's like, people just like it, for connecting with people, but it doesn't impair you. So it's like an anytime use type of creativity, flow state, and, type of thing, where it's just like, it's like a add to the stack kind of thing. I don't think I've like, and that's another thing too that's kept me in it, because I don't really get involved with things after everything that I've been through personally, and just like, I'm interested in like what really works. Because whenever I was sick, my back was up against the wall. The only thing that mattered, like I couldn't bullshit my way through that situation, right? And like I had to, the only thing that mattered was what was real. And so like even afterwards, it's like I only really get excited about stuff that either moves the dial or has a tangible effect to it, or that brings some inherent value, in a way. And it's weird, because there's almost like a, I don't want to say like cult-like community, but like, even before this started to become more popular stuff, there were whole forums online that were dedicated like Kava forums and stuff, where people just talk about Kava all the time because they just become like obsessed with it and trying to like share different strains, like how are you preparing it, what are you doing, all that kind of stuff. It's something that just breeds culture.
Yeah.
People just, because it's not even at the end of it's not even about the Kava after a while. It's about the state that it puts you in. Yeah. That's good for so many other things.
No, I'm with you, man.
So,
well, I'll link out to True Kava down below. And Cameron, where can everyone find you and also the coalition as well?
Yeah. So you can find everything at truekava.com. That's TRUKAVA, not TRUE. It's TRUKAVA.com. You can find all our stuff there. And you can also, to keep up with anything, we have a total archive of all the major published studies on Kava and everything at the kavacoalition.org website. Everything that we're doing, initiatives, articles getting written, stuff that we're doing with everything as far as updates on what we're trying to do and get done culturally with Kava. I'll say, one more thing as far as the, we're kind of in the middle, like we talked about earlier, of like all these adjacent, like emerging movements, right? That I think is just kind of, it's a nature reintegration. The culture is shifting really quickly. We've got AI. There's a lot of things that are, the world is becoming very, very different, very, very quickly. And I think that we're having to scramble to adapt to maintain our humanity. And I think that we're going to see a big divergence in the coming years. People who sort of come back to that initial truth. And it doesn't mean that you can't still have modern amenities, but create strategies that don't contradict or undermine that truth and supersede it. And there's going to be a separate group that is sort of like an anything goes, just inject me with whatever, integrate me with every form of AI mixed with biology or whatever. And I just think that there's a lot of these good movements that we're seeing are people that are really, really trying to maintain our humanity. And a lot of that is a relook at how we relate to, altering our consciousness and the quality of altering our consciousness. So a lot of this conversation, Michael Pollan, he was on Joe's show, Rogan's show, a couple of years ago in one of his books where he was talking about how coffee he did a beautiful job articulating this, how coffee helped to shape the productivity-driven collective mind of our culture in the early 1900s. Even the advent of coffee breaks was done to create sort of a collective wiring of focused productivity, of like that kind of rat race mentality. And so, as we talked about earlier, a lot of the collective higher values and aspirations of a culture are contributed to and shaped by the altered states and rituals that they used in to connect. And so my whole thing with this is always like, like a medicine like this is good, but what it's going to symbolize, the brand, what we're trying to build into it, but also just Kava in general, is just as important or more important than what it is.
Yeah.
It's a different way of approaching human connection, of altering our consciousness and a return to authenticity. And we wanted to sort of like symbolize that. And in a similar way to what he describes, with coffee, if you inject a substance, and we already have a case study of it in the South Pacific, like Kava, that generates this level-headedness and empathy and this authenticity and connection with nature. If you get millions of people, consistently daily in a state of that quality, then it can have a transformative effect on the culture. So that's always been my higher thing, and that's what I think. I like to contextualize that, just because people, whenever they get involved in something, it's not just about the substance itself. It's sort of about the larger movement around it, and it opens up so much conversation. That's like a community of people that support that pursuit. So
you see that in your family, in families all the time, with like one person goes and like does a psychedelic journey or something, and it has this ripple effect throughout the family, right? You just see it at a small scale there.
Yeah,
it's like one person changing their energy and changing how they view has this ripple effect, even on just as much as a household, right? And you think if like you have a whole neighborhood do that, or if you like, call it a collective energy or call it just statistics, right? If you have more people thinking a certain way and it changes the course of the world.
Yeah, exactly. Just being reflective and just, honest reflection, and just genuine communication and interaction, which has been kind of a staple of what we've been talking about here, of just like the breakdown in communication at the cellular level, at the cultural level, and why it's like, because you have these deep dive conversations all the time. How often do you run into situations where there's a language barrier, or you're trying to describe something and someone's trolling you over it, and you're like, dude, no, this is a language thing, and it's a partial thing here, and it's a process. It's not a destination. You know, we're always building evidence towards something, but we just also have a genuine intuitive sense, so we can go back to base principles on what's worked historically, and just base things of like, okay, if it deviates from the intelligence that our body is built off of past a certain point, then we might want to look at it with a certain level of skepticism. And if it's totally in line with it, then, you know, we don't necessarily need all the studies in the world to go ahead and start using it, you know, like, come on.
The Lindy effect, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like something's been used for a long time. And well, Cameron, dude, I appreciate this, man.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.